On June 11th, 1933, a young boy in Steelville, Missouri was searching for arrowheads along a creek bed when his hand brushed against something half buried in the soil. He expected a small artifact, maybe a bead, maybe a tool. But what he uncovered was a skull, and not a skull that belonged to any normal human being. The jaw was massive, large enough to swallow a clenched fist. The bone was thick, heavy, built like stone, and when the rest of the skeleton was carefully exposed, laid out in the summer grass and measured by the town doctor, it stretched nearly 8 feet long, broad shoulders, a rib cage like a barrel, perfectly aligned teeth, not 1 row, but 2. The local newspaper reported it. Curious families came to see it for themselves. Photographs were taken, measurements recorded, and then, as often happened in those days, the Smithsonian wrote a request for immediate transfer. The skeleton was packed into a crate, tagged for shipment to Washington, D.C., placed onto a rail car, and never seen again. But the true shock is not that one giant skeleton was found. It's that discoveries like this were happening everywhere. All across the late 1800s and early 1900s, reports like this appeared and vanished like sparks in wind. From the burial mounds of Ohio to the caves of Nevada, from the beaches of Catalina Island to the hills of West Virginia, skeletons measuring 7, 8, even 10 feet tall were unearthed by farmers, miners, archaeologists, and road workers. Some had skulls twice as thick as anything in medical literature. Some had double rows of teeth. Some were found with armour, pearl ornaments, or red hair still clinging to leathery scalp. Hundreds of discoveries were published in newspapers. Thousands were catalogued in county records. Bones boxed, measured, tagged with shipment orders, and again the same pattern repeated, unearthed, documented, sent to the Smithsonian, gone forever. No display, no press release, no museum exhibit for the public to view, just vanished evidence. Bones that were large enough to rewrite what we believe about early America, quietly absorbed into the nation's greatest archive of history and then sealed away from it. If it happened once, we could call it unusual. If it happened twice, suspicious. But it did not happen twice. It happened for decades, maybe over a century. So tonight, we're going to follow that trail. The bones, the caves, the mounds, the shipping forms, the missing records, all of it, to ask the question that no textbook, no museum, and no institution seems eager to answer. Did the Smithsonian deliberately rewrite America's past and erase the existence of ancient giants? To understand why that question isn't born from fantasy or paranoia, we need to return to where this story begins. Not in a museum, not in a laboratory, but at the edge of a quiet creek on a summer morning. The creek runs quiet in early light, water sliding over pebbles with a glassy hush. You can hear cicadas start their steady drone in the cottonwoods. The air hangs warm already, smelling of wet clay and sun-warmed grass. A boy walks the shallow bend with his shoes off, cuffs rolled, pockets heavy with flint points he picked from the gravel. He moves slow, toes searching by feel, slipping through silt and smooth stone. A dragonfly lands on his knee, rests, then flicks away. When his fingers press into a pocket of mud near the bank, they meet something hard and curved, too smooth to be rock, too wide to be a shell. He pokes again, then pushes his whole hand in, and the thing refuses to give. The sound of the creek doesn't change. The day holds its easy pace. But under the water, there is weight. He crouches, digs with both hands, pulling at roots and slick weeds. A pale arc rises through the silt like a moon, then another. He pries until his fingernails go dark with grit. The shape grows. He brings up a curve that fits no arrowhead and no deer bone he's seen strung on a porch nail. Sunlight glints on wet ivory as he frees a dome from the mud, and the rush of water makes a soft clap against it. He hauls, braces, and the cold heft of a skull slips from the bank and lands in his arms. He expects it to feel hollow. It doesn't. It drags his elbows down. He hugs it to his chest the way you hug a heavy pumpkin. It takes 2 tries to get it into the shallows without dropping it on his feet. He shouts for someone. The shout sounds small against the woods. A farmhand from up the road hears him and wades in, trousers darkening, hands outstretched, his boots filling with creek water. The boy pushes the skull toward him, and the man tries to lift it like a normal skull, from jaw and crown. It doesn't rise easily. He has to set his stance, bend his back, and hoist. The bone shows thick under the scrape marks, the sockets large as teacups, the cheekbones broader than any face he's known. He carries it to the bank and sets it in grass. A beetle crawls from one nasal cavity, pauses, then vanishes beneath a leaf. No one speaks for a long count. By noon, the bank holds a small crowd. A shovel scrapes stone with that dry ring you can hear at a distance. Neighbours pass a rope and drag back more earth. The ground gives up ribs one by one, curving out like slats from a barrel. Each piece comes up heavy, stain the colour of weak tea. Dirt clings in the sutures on the skull, the way dust sticks to old glass. The town doctor, sleeves rolled, kneels at the edge of the trench and brushes a femur clean with a handkerchief he folded to save from tearing. He doesn't joke, he doesn't speculate out loud. He measures with a tape that looks too short and then fetches another from his bag. They lay the bones on quilts in the shade. A woman fetches water with lemon slices floating in it and sets the jar at the doctor's elbow. The skull sits in the grass with the jaw tilted open, teeth gleaming where the mud rubbed away. There are more of them than you expect to see in a mouth. The top line looks doubled, the bottom the same, neat and even. Sunlight plays on enamel and makes the edges bright. The doctor presses his thumb to a molar and does not move for several breaths. A boy from the next farm stands beside the skull, small as a sapling next to a barrel, trying to look brave. Someone lifts the camera, the kind that eats glass plates and needs the sun to sit still, and the shutter clicks with a brisk, exact note that seems to echo off the water. Word runs faster than the creek. A county man arrives in a wagon, dust on his hat brim and a pencil behind his ear. He counts vertebrae. He bends the tape over that long femur twice, then a third time, then shakes out his hand and measures again. The bone is longer than a man's thigh and thicker at the ends than his palm. The neighbours shift closer and then pull back, as if getting near something so strange might offend it, might wake it somehow. One old man murmurs a line from church with his hat in his hands. Another woman touches the skull lightly with 2 fingers, then wipes her fingers on her apron like she touched a stove. The doctor starts laying numbers into a notebook, quick and careful. He notes cranial width. He notes the breadth across the orbits. The jaw takes both hands to lift, and when he does, it shuts with a dull clack. He calls for a scale, but the post office scale won't travel. They use a grocer's balance instead, the kind that weighs flour. The needle jumps and quivers. It settles higher than anyone thought bone could weigh. The doctor doesn't say a conclusion. He just writes, and his handwriting tightens. Hours pass and the skeleton grows in the grass. It reaches a length where no one wants to say numbers anymore, so they say past 7 and then past 8, and then they stop. The ribs curve like the hull of a canoe. The pelvis, when lifted, makes the 2 men who carry it frown with the strain. It doesn't feel weak. It doesn't feel like the hollow frames of the medical skeletons in the schoolhouse. It feels dense. It feels made for force. The skull stares at the tree line as if waiting for someone late to arrive. The doctor cleans his lenses with a cloth and takes another photograph. He gestures for a child to stand beside the femur to give scale. The boy stands with his arms at his sides, jaw clenched, chin down. He looks like he's posing next to a telephone pole. The shutter snaps again. In the pause that follows, a jay squawks, and a train miles away sends a low note across fields that could be thunder. The air sits thick and still. A storm might come, or it might not. The weather doesn't answer either way. Before the light fails, a letter is drafted on the doctor's desk. It has the right tone and the right facts. It carries numbers instead of adjectives. The paper smells faintly of ink and phenol. The next day, a reply comes faster than usual mail, as if there were a telegraph wire hidden in the cornrows. A formal letterhead. A request that is really an instruction. A crate is ordered from the depot, the wood green and sticky with sap. Men line it with straw and sawdust from the planing mill. The doctor wraps the skull in burlap. He uses muslin on the teeth so they don't chip. He ties each bundle with twine he measures twice. On the platform, people gather early. They do not normally come to see freight move east, but this feels like saying goodbye to a relative you only just met. The crate is stenciled with a destination and a number. The tag reads Anthropological Specimen Priority in a hand that practiced the words many times before. The station master frowns, not at the crate, but at the idea of getting the crate wrong. When the freight train rolls in, hot iron smell and the squeal of brakes. The men lift with knees bent and backs straight. A child steps forward as if to touch the wood, then thinks better of it. The crate slides into a car and vanishes behind a stack of barrels banded with steel. The doctor writes again that night, and he keeps a copy this time. He places the copy in his desk under a ledger of births. In the morning he goes about his rounds and people stop him to ask if there has been an answer. Not yet, he says. Soon, he says. He has hope in his voice because he watched the train leave, and the sound of its going felt like progress. In town, men gather at the feed store and retell the scene, each adding a small detail they saw from their angle. The way the jaw hung, the smell of the creek bed turned over, the way the tape measure felt too short in the hand. Days become 2 weeks. A reply arrives in a neat envelope with type neat as a comb. It thanks, and it notes, and it says the specimen is under review. Then nothing comes. Another letter arrives after more days pass, this one brief. A few lines that say records are being sorted and cataloguing is underway. People read the note and look at the doctor as if he can translate it into something solid. He can't. He writes again and waits. At the depot, the station master checks his ledger for the outgoing freight number. He finds the page. The lines read, received, dispatched, and then the space for delivered remains blank, not crossed out, just blank. He licks a thumb and turns more pages, then fewer, then goes back to the same page. The paper smells like dust and oil. He shrugs. It happens, he says, but not like this. The doctor goes to his office and opens the drawer and looks at the copy of his letter and the one reply. He places them back in the drawer with careful hands. A month trails into another. Harvest comes on. People have things to do. The creek drops in the heat. Children wade the same bend, toes curling against the same stones. Without the bones on the grass, the story feels heavier than the skull did. Neighbours stop naming numbers and begin to say, "You saw it," as if sight itself might be a kind of proof that the mail cannot file. A woman who gave lemonade sits on her porch in the evening and watches the sun go down behind the mill. She thinks of the teeth and the way the enamel caught the light. She thinks of how you can lose something you never had to begin with. When another letter finally comes, it says the specimen cannot be located in the collection as presently arranged. It lists possible reasons that sound tidy: mislabeling, reclassification, deterioration, due to poor preservation before receipt. It suggests patience. The doctor reads it twice, and then he doesn't read it again. It goes into the drawer with the others. He starts to avoid the subject when he checks pulses and sets bones. He has a practice to run. People need stitches and quinine and an ear he can lend. The skull becomes a topic for porches and sidewalks, not sick rooms. The quilts that held the bones are laundered to strip the clay colour. The stains don't go. The families fold them anyway and put them away on high shelves. You can almost feel the weight again when you touch those old stitches. The camera plates are tucked into a cupboard for safekeeping. Someone plans to send duplicates east and then forgets. School starts. The river cools. The cottonwoods drop their leaves, and the creek shows more of its stones. The doctor keeps his notebook on the desk and never flips past the page with the measurements. The number at the bottom has a line through it where the pencil slipped. Years later, the boy who found the first curve will tell the story in a voice men lean forward to hear. He will say how cold the bone felt in the summer heat. He will say how that jaw wanted 2 hands. He will say how the train took the crate and how the town stood there, hats low against the glare, the engine's heat beating their shins. He will say the air smelled like hot iron and creosote and cut wood. He will not say numbers. He will say it was more than a man, and people will nod, because they have their own details they carry, and each makes a small pile at the centre of the room. Some whisper, this is how such stories end, not with denial, but with filing. Critics counter that crates get lost and bones break, and records, even careful ones, go thin with time. The truth, perhaps, sits somewhere between, on a shelf in a warehouse, in a misnumbered box, in a label that fell off and slipped down into the crack between floorboards. But if you stand at the creek bend where the boy stood and listened to water over stone, the air holding that old sweet smell of clay, you feel the edge of a larger question. Because if a skull could sit in the grass under Missouri sun, a jaw that takes 2 hands to lift, teeth bright as coins, and if a town could weigh the bones and write the numbers and send the crate east, and if all that could happen and still nothing returns, not the skull, not a note with a catalogue number, not a display with a quiet plaque, then the story does not live only here. The map wants to widen. The creek wants to pour into a river. Another cave waits on the far side of a mountain. A mound sits under a cornfield where no one looks. A depot ledger in another state carries another line with received and dispatched, and a blank where delivered should be. The pattern tilts in the light, and its meaning sharpens. If bones can go missing like that once, measured and photographed and shipped, what happens when they show up again in other valleys and other summers, and the crates keep rolling toward the same doors? The creek air cools as the sound of water fades, and the view lifts. Night settles over a map of the United States like a dark canvas, then points of warm light blink on. Valleys glow, deserts spark, river bends rim with a thin gold edge, and circles rise where earthworks ring old prairie. Each flare marks a report, a dig, a measurement in pencil, a crate on a rail car. You watch the speckled pattern spread, not random, almost rhythmic, as if something old once crossed the continent and left its bones like mile markers no one taught you to read. Ohio comes into focus first. A damp field near a cemetery, the smell of wet clay and cut grass, and farm hands pulling a slab aside with rope burn on their palms. Beneath, skulls that feel wrong under the fingers, heavy, dense, walls thick enough to drum. In West Virginia, dawn steam rises off a mound as men pry open a chamber lined in soil shades, copper pendants catching the first light on rib cages that would outsize most coffins. South of there, a Mississippi quarry crew hammers into a bank and jolts to a stop when a pelvis plate clinks like rock but weighs like iron. The foreman calls the paper before lunch. By evening, the story names a height most refuse to say out loud. The scenes repeat as if someone traced them on carbon paper. A limestone hollow in Kentucky. Torches slouch and smoke curls along the ceiling. Pickaxes leave bright scars on the cavern wall, and bones lift from clay like roots yanked from a garden that forgot it was planted. A county doctor weighs a femur in 2 hands and frowns at the heft. A reporter scratches inches and fractions into a notebook with ink that smears on his thumb. The next morning a headline lands on doorsteps, and within days someone in a neat hand labels a crate. After that the room goes quiet, not denial, just the kind of quiet that cancels questions. Nevada pulls you west with heat shimmering off alkali flats. The mouth of Lovelock Cave yawns dark and dry, and the smell of guano rides the wind like old fertilizer mixed with dust. Miners crawl on elbows, their lanterns throwing orange ovals over broken baskets and mats. A sandal turns up with a sole long enough to span 2 forearms end to end. Another pair sits side by side, wide at the toe, stitched in a pattern the miners don't bother to name, they just stare. In a pocket of shade, a figure lies curled, hair faded to rust where it brushes woven fabric. The room temperature drops like a held breath. Some whisper the stories weren't stories after all. Not all of it stayed underground. In the 1890s, front pages treated giant bones found in mound like weather, common enough to print without italics. Postcards showed graves cut into clay with figures stretched past the yardsticks laid at their thighs. County ledgers included sketches in the margins, notes about jaw circumference, and the words unusual thickness, repeated in different hands across different years. It reads like a time before people learned what not to say. Down the coast, the Pacific breaks cold on Catalina's rocky shore. An amateur collector, sleeves rolled, sunburn deepening in the salt air, keeps careful tally of what the island gives up. Skulls stacked along a shed wall, calipers biting down on bone, measurements penciled on tags with dates and lot numbers. Thousands go into the books. Then the ledger pages thin. The tallest entries stop mid-sentence. A display closes. The most improbable items no longer appear on the invoice. Supporters suggest that a purchase order ended up doing what flames and time could not. The old witnesses were already speaking. The Paiute carried the sea to care in their memory like a warning. Giants with hair the colour of desert clay. Hunters not just of game, but of people. The Choctaw told of Nahullo, so tall-brushed that Holtzmen barely touches their knees. In their telling, these aren't campfire creatures, but neighbours at war, with names and habits and faults. That kind of specificity wins a different kind of respect. Others dismiss these accounts as metaphor, but the details hold. Diet, height, hair, weapons, even before shovels break ground. The circle widens as you listen. Lakota stories mention towering enemies brought down at great cost. Comanche memory carries raids that feel like storms. Iroquois nations speak in different tongues, but some phrases land the same. Long bones, great strength, hunger that marks the seasons. When languages with no shared root align on anatomy, the pattern tilts in the light, and its meaning sharpens. You can almost see a thread drawing from the plains to the woodlands to the islands offshore. Back on the map, the pinpoints collect along waterways as if the bones loved rivers. Reports from Ohio stack up beside ancient earthworks, where fields hide circles and octagons the size of small towns. Near Newark, survey stakes cross a meadow that still remembers precise geometry. In Miamisburg, a mound rises so smooth it looks like a hill, yet a skeptic looking down into the chamber would count ribs that don't match a standard chart. A Mississippi crossing hears gossip about jawbones that will swallow a man's head like a horseshoe. A California rancho sees a jaw so large a soldier lifts it like a mask over his face and laughs before quieting. Some of these lines blur, enough remain crisp to keep you awake. Newspaper editors once printed without flinching. A column might list a height and a femur length in consecutive figures, then move on to farm news. An issue or two later, a correction would appear about name spelled wrong. The original measurements stand. A few decades on, summaries rewrite those scenes into something tame. Unusually tall, large indigenous specimen, misreported size. Critics counter that hair changes colour underground, and that skull wall thickness varies more than folk think. All true in some cases. Yet mid-sentence reductions still leave a taste of sanitizing after the ink dries. Lovelock returns like a refrain because that site checks boxes few others do. Miners went for fertilizer and left a trail of artifacts thick enough to force a university dig. Soot clung to the ceiling in layers that wouldn't wash away with a century of wind. Baskets lay in heaps sized for large hands. Reports mentioned bones with marks like someone drew a line down the marrow channel with a blade. The figure measured well past the usual, hair faded but present. Later summaries lower the number, sharpen the language, trim the edges. Then the tallest details go thin in the official record, like breath on a cold mirror fading away. In California waters, Catalina's ledger whispers through what it won't say. Over 3,000 entries, and yet the most extraordinary bones drift out of sight. A measuring rod in an old photograph shows numbers that don't match familiar frames. Then the images pause. The display that once stood open to the public goes private, and a purchase brings the collection under a single roof. Storage can be safety. Storage can be a quiet room with a locked door no one has a key for anymore. All this runs parallel with a quieter chorus. The tribes don't speak of giants like a sensation. They mention warriors with copper ornaments buried in mounds, sandals that would fit the people their elders named, and a war that did not end with a treaty but with ash. When oral history carries places, materials and methods, it stops feeling like poetry and starts to behave like a ledger you can't misfile. You begin to sense that the people who lived beside these beings held them as part of the landscape. Dangerous, yes, but local, specific, theirs to remember. In the Midwest, the pattern grows almost boring in its consistency, which is its power. A farmer uncovers a skull with walls so thick a drill bit fights it. A sheriff brings a scale to weigh a bone because a tape measure no longer captures the problem. A doctor writes a number, signs his name, adds his town. The clipping makes a scrapbook. The scrapbook survives in a library basement that smells like linen and dust. Inside, a boy's face beams next to a tibia taller than his chest. The casualness of everyone's posture sticks with you. They didn't seem to think they were handling a myth. From there, the coast-to-coast rhythm becomes hard to ignore. Ohio, West Virginia, Kentucky, Arkansas, Nevada, California, up the Mississippi, along the Missouri, island shores, cave mouths, mound hearts. Heights cross the 7-foot mark more than once. Double rows of teeth appear in notes from different states. Skulls described as elongated show up twice in places that shared no county line. Some details could be error or storytelling drift. But when the same quirk lands in different hands, it starts to read like a feature, not a flourish. The minds of editors shift over the decades. Early columns treat bones as news, whether curious or solemn. Later, the tone changes. Skepticism becomes policy. Isolationist frameworks in anthropology grow teeth in a desk drawer, and diffusionist whispers move off the lecture schedule. The public story narrows as funding aligns with comfort. That's how institutions often move. Incremental, courteous, decisive. You don't need a villain if a filing cabinet will do. Meanwhile, crates move. Rail cars rattle under them. A clerk stamps received, then steps out for coffee. A museum changes a wing, combines 2 departments, retires a curator, updates a system. Files migrate. A label falls off. A box goes 2 shelves deeper. People like to think a building with marble columns guarantees memory. The truth, perhaps, is that memory needs tending, or it grows wild and covers the path in a season. The names that crest again and again, Lovelock, Miamisburg, Newark, Catalina, aren't scattered accidents. They sit on old travel routes and near earthworks that map the sky. They carry artifacts that fit large hands and bones that ask the same unkind question. Who wore these bodies? And what did they build? If the answer were simple, it would have stayed on the surface. It didn't. Some whisper that an entire population once lived among early Americans, a branch or a hybrid, a tall nation threaded through migration and trade. Others dismiss the notion and point to hoaxes that muddied the water down the line. Both currents run in the same river. The older articles, the tagged bones, the calm labels, the county hands measuring in inches, all of them remain, even as newer laughter tries to drown the murmur. The map glows brighter as if trying to overwhelm your eyes. Then it softens, dimming your view to a single desert cave where a fire once raged until soot thickened into a permanent paint on stone. The story waiting there is not a single skeleton or a lonely report. It is a war remembered in detail, an end sealed with timber and heat, and a silence that followed for centuries. If the bones scattered across the continent raised a question, the cave holds an answer that smells like smoke and carries the weight of a vanished world. The wind moves across Nevada's alkali flats like a slow broom, brushing grit against your ankles and the rims of old lake beds. The air tastes faintly of salt and dust. Red stone caves rise out of the desert like broken teeth, their mouths dark and cool even under noon heat. A hawk circles once silent. Somewhere in that hush, the Paiute speak of a people who once walked here, tall enough to block the sun, red hair catching the light like embers. Their name in the old stories is Sita Ka. In that tongue the word is tied to reed boats and a way of life on the old water, but the memory cuts deeper. The tales say these were not neighbours. The tales say they hunted humans, stole children from camps, and fed on the bodies of the fallen. Not in symbols, but in acts. Some whisper they towered over ordinary people, their steps too long for a normal trail, their strength out of scale with the land. If you listen closely, the tone changes when elders speak of the last days. Tribes that quarrelled over grazing or water set those arguments aside. Runners carried messages between camps. Bows were strung. The story moves toward a limestone cave with a wide throat tucked into a red bluff. Warriors drew the giants inside, pushing them back with arrows and spears. When the Sitaka refused to surrender, brush and timber were piled high across the entrance. The air smelled of sage and resin. Fire took the mouth of the cave. People say the cries carried over the flats and died with the embers. That is the shape of the myth. Years pass. The ground stays quiet. Then a new figure enters the scene, a mining engineer with a stubborn streak and a notebook in his pocket. John T. Reed arrives in the 1880s to work, but the elder's stories catch his ear. He hears the same points repeated in different voices. The red hair, the cave, the fire, the end. He walks the flats and checks the strata. He follows gullies that drain into nowhere. He keeps going until a blackened arch of stone looks back at him. All that running ash above the roofline set into the rock like a bruise that never healed. Time moves again. The year is 1911. Guano miners come for fertilizer, not law. They bring shovels and sacks and a schedule. Inside the cave, the air is thick and musty. Guano clings to the walls, dry and crumbly under the fingers. A shovel blade slides, catches and rings against something harder than waste. Wood, woven reed. The edge of a basket too large for ordinary hands. 15-inch sandals sit in the dust, straps cracked, but still holding their shape. You can see the curve where a heel once pressed down. Layer by layer, the miners open the floor. They fill burlap bags without ceremony. They stack them in heaps and haul them out. The cave gives up more than fertilizer. The ceiling wears a coat of soot so heavy it looks like a storm cloud frozen in stone. It does not wash off with a century of desert wind. The colour goes deeper than surface stain, set in by heat strong enough to peel water from rock. As word spreads, the mood shifts. What the miners pulled out by accident pulls people in on purpose. Formal digs take shape the next year. 1912 brings clipboards and labelled boxes. The University of California sends L.L. Loud to collect, sort and tag. He works by lantern light and daylight both, building piles of reed mats, nets and baskets. The count begins to climb into the thousands. Among the more unsettling finds, bones show signs of splitting that speak to marrow taking. Critics counter that ancient people used every part of animal and man in ritual or survival. The line between custom and hunger blurs in a place like this. A second major expedition follows in 1924 under Mark Harrington, widening the scope. The artifacts crest past 10,000. Tools, sandals, projectile points, fishhooks, and woven items built with skill and speed. The reed work is fine and even. Some baskets are so large 2 hands are needed to hold them at the rim. The scale hints at someone tall enough to need more reach in everyday tasks. A few human remains appear preserved by the cave's dry breath, with hair still clinging to skulls in a red tint that refuses to fade with time. That red hair matters to people who know the stories. It lines up too neatly with the Paiute's old accounts. Supporters suggest the match is more than coincidence, that memory held a true detail and carried it forward intact. Others dismissed the hue as an effect of burial chemistry and decay, where dark hair lightens in death. Even so, descriptions of height begin to drift toward the upper ends of human range. One mummy is said to stand nearly 7 feet when measured. Another, by some reports, pushes 9. That number moves eyebrows even among those used to tall men. Photographs exist. Measuring tapes stretch across long bones. Field journals carry lines of a neat pen strokes that read, like men trying to keep their breath steady. The odd detail recurs: sandals that would dwarf modern footwear, reed boats for a vanished lake, bone tools sized for a grip larger than most. The tone in these notes is methodical, not fevered, a good sign in work like this. Even so, when later summaries are drafted for broader academic audiences, the language cools. Giant becomes large, redhead becomes red-stained. The taller mummies slide into silence, as if they walked behind a curtain. Inside the cave, a handprint high on the wall sets its own problem. It sits above an easy reach, and the spread of the fingers looks wide beyond comfort. Could smoke and soot distort shapes and fool the eye? Possibly. Could a person stand on debris or ledges and press a palm into the black? Also possible, yet the mark lingers in reports, a small provocation that refuses to leave the room. The soot is the opposite of ambiguous. It coats corners and keystones in matte black layers that do not scale away. Any visitor with a flashlight can spot how deep the burn goes. It sounds exactly like what the Paiute story would leave behind if the story were true. Fire fed by brush and timber. Smoke stuck to stone, season after season, while outside the desert scrub grew back and bones cooled. There is another detail that sits like gravel under the tongue. Earlier reports speak plainly of mummified remains with unusual height and reddish hair. The words are unguarded. They carry measurements and simple awe. Later texts smooth these edges. Large indigenous specimens becomes the preferred phrase, a safe distance from troubling claims. Some of that restraint might be caution, scholars avoiding headline traps and tall tales. Some whisper it is something else, a tidy frame built to cover a view the institution does not favour. Beyond language, there is the matter of custody. Artefacts leave the cave in crates and travel to museums. Tools, sandals and baskets go on display. Visitors can find them even now, glass cases holding what were once useful things. But bones are a different category. The public trail blurs. This is where policy and practice enter. Human remains in institutions fall under changing rules across decades, especially with the rise of repatriation laws. In that shuffle, chains of custody can fray. Records fade. Items are reclassified, archived, or removed from sight. Still, the specific claims here draw attention because they align across 2 record types: oral traditions and field notes. The Paiute speak of red-haired giants driven into a cave and burned. Early excavations record red hair and great size among certain remains. The cave ceiling carries soot too thick to argue. Oversized sandals and baskets rest in museum basements and displays. The pathway between those points is not neat, but it is not empty either. The strongest counterpoints focus on natural hair changes after death, the human tendency to misjudge height in partial remains, and the chaos of early guano digging that mixed layers and contexts. Those are fair cautions. Bones moved by miners can be stripped of the data that would settle doubts. Disturbed strata turn numbers into guesswork, and the human eye loves an outlier. A long femur draws the gaze while ordinary bones look ordinary and get ignored. Even under those cautions, the numbers tug. A sandal over 15 inches suggests a foot that would ask for a very tall frame. Baskets built with a broader grip hint at hands that could fill them. The reports of bones split for marrow fit the darker part of the oral accounts. It is not proof on its own, but it is a stack of details that lean in one direction. Follow that lean, and a picture forms of a people adapted to a world that once held more megafauna, more weight in the grass. If so, they would have needed stronger bones to carry that height. Broader jaws might have served diets that demanded power. We do not have a complete set laid out for clear comparison. We have notes, photographs, artifacts, a cave that still smells faintly of old smoke when the air stands still. The pattern tilts in the light, and its meaning sharpens. Consider one more on-the-ground moment. A miner wipes dust from his lips with the back of his hand. He lifts a woven sandal, surprised by how heavy it feels even dried out. He calls to a partner and holds it up by the strap. It swings like a pendulum wider than his palm. Later, a researcher copies measurements into a ledger, pencil point dulling. The number looks odd to him too. He does not add an exclamation mark. He writes the next line. The museum path is far less cinematic. A crate shifts from a rail car to a loading dock. A clerk ticks a box. The crate moves again to a shelf. Years add up. Exhibits change. If two mummies with red hair and extreme height were photographed and described, they are not on public view now. The gap between early documentation and current display grows like a crack from corner to corner. Critics counter that sensational claims always outpace evidence, and that anything outsized draws a crowd first and a correction later. That pattern exists. So does another, where uncomfortable finds lose heat in storage until the debate cools. It takes energy to break either pattern. It takes access to records, permission to test, and a tolerance for results that might not please anyone. You stand at the cave mouth in late afternoon. Heat leaves the rock in waves. The ceiling above holds that old black skin of soot, and the floor breathes out a chill from deeper chambers. The day is bright outside, but inside the light goes soft like the room would prefer you bring a flame. Wind sifts grit along the threshold. There is a feeling here of something finished and something unfinished at once. Two tall mummies with red hair, documented by early expeditions, would be the anchor that either holds this story in place or drags it under. They are the hinge, the difference between tale and testimony. Their absence is its own text, written in empty cases and quiet catalogue drawers. If they surfaced, even for a day, what else would rise with them? The creek cools your shins as you wade out of Missouri and into the map. The sound thins, traded for a low paper rustle and the faint rattle of train tracks far off. A dotted line of pins glows against a dark outline of the United States. Each pin is a place where someone bent down and lifted history that didn't match the chart on a classroom wall. Start in Ohio's heartland, where the ground under cemeteries holds rooms cut into clay long before any city grid. Cemetery workers swing shovels, metal ringing on something harder than root. The first chamber opens like a cold breath from the earth. A femur is carried out wrapped in sackcloth to keep it from crumbling. Measured end to end, the bone runs 28 inches. A photographer plants a tripod and frames it beside two men whose chests do not reach the length of that single thigh. Ink dries on a headline that doesn't blink or hedge. A giant of prehistoric race. It lands on breakfast tables without comment about fairy tales. In the photo, hats tilt, not out of awe but to keep sun from their eyes. Follow the rail west, gravel dust on boots, the taste of iron in the air. At Lompoc Rancho in California, soldiers dig for a powder magazine and hit a sarcophagus longer than anyone expects to find on a windy bluff. Boards lift, and the smell is old leather and desert. The form inside stretches about 12 feet. Wrapped in skins, set with carved shells marked by symbols no one there can read, the skull shows two tight rows of teeth. Witnesses mutter that the jaw looks large enough to slip over a man's face. Some whisper that local tribes asked for reburial and the ground closed. Others dismiss it as a campfire tale wrapped in a uniform. The land now belongs to a base with fences and cameras, where wind tugs at flags and stories walk in circles. The sea speaks a different language at Catalina Island. Ralph Glidden drags crates down plank floors and stacks them with handwriting on small tags. He runs a private museum with jars, baskets, spears and bones arranged under glass. He writes numbers in pencil. He works through burial grounds and counts thousands of skeletons, cataloguing and charging admission like it's a roadside attraction and an archive at once. Some of the bones stretch measurements into 7, 8, even 9 feet. He stands a measuring rod in the frame for proof. Men lean in, women cover their mouths, children stare. Years pass like tide, and the display stays up. Then purchase papers arrive. Institutions box what he collected. The tallest entries fade from inventory lists like ink left in sun. Supporters suggest the ledger gaps are more than clerical drift. Critics counter that Glidden chased spectacle. The room is quiet either way. An empty case gathers dust where a crowd once filled the doorway. Up the Mississippi, heat draws sweat as crews chip stone in quarries and cut new channels for river traffic. At Sauk Rapids, a jawbone shows up among gravel like a grin. Workers joke, then try it on and find a man's head can fit inside the curve like a horseshoe. There's laughter, then the kind of stillness you can hear. The local paper sends a reporter who writes by the smell of ink and oil. He watches as the bone rides a wagon to a depot. There's a label tied with string, a destination typed cleanly. People from miles around come to look before the crate leaves. By sundown, the depot floor is swept, and the only sign left is a darker rectangle of dust where the box sat. The pattern isn't subtle when you stand close. A farmer pries a skull free with a flat shovel and runs a thumb over teeth packed in 2 neat lines. A doctor in shirt sleeves weighs a femur in both hands and finds he can't pretend it's a trick of the light. A reporter notes figures in a margin, draws a small sketch. Photos click, measurements set. Then the call comes, the letter arrives, the crate is built. Boards closed, nails tapped flat, shipping tags tied. The rhythm holds. Find, photograph, measure, remove, disappear. Across the Midwest, mounds rise like green whales under corn and lawn. Miamisburg has a slope that fills the eye. Workmen dig and pull out skeletons larger than anyone expects from what schoolbooks call the Adena. A curator with steady hands inspects a skull and says, in a line that lives in clippings, that its authenticity is beyond doubt and its age is great. The bones sit in a small museum for a time. They do not sit now. At Creset in West Virginia, a clean trench opens like a page. In 1959, a skeleton measuring 7 feet 2 inches comes up. The long bones heavy, the proportions not the spindly stretch of illness. A respected curator publishes a photo, and scientific journals note the work. The frame exists, the caption exists. The bones no longer do, at least in any room the public can enter. Between sights, the small human acts repeat and fix themselves in the mind. A clerk inks a receiving stamp on a form that lists contents in a tidy hand. A conductor watches loaders slide a crate into a rail car and shuts the door with a steel clatter. A county judge signs a transfer and taps the paper with a dry finger. A widow saves a newspaper with a giant headline and folds it enough times to crease a face. These aren't legends. They are the ordinary mechanics of movement. After they run, some entries stay traceable. Others thin out and stop. Back on Catalina, the catalogues show names and numbers by the thousand. The room once had a case with a small girl's skeleton, laid within a large urn and ringed by the remains of dozens of children, a layout that spoke rank and grief. A list mentions a 28-inch femur. People paid a quarter to stand on worn boards and read handwritten cards nailed beneath bone. When the collection changed hands, the oddest entries blurred. The public exhibits shrank, then closed. For years, those who went to see the tallest of the finds found empty space where the cards said they should be. Newspaper presses in the 1890s were loud and greasy. A hand that ran them pulled giant reports through like any other story. Found in a mound, massive pelvis, skull of unusual thickness, giant warrior with copper ornaments. Postcards were sold, and some still sit in shoeboxes, silvering around the edges. In a Minnesota thriving on flour and timber, the Worthington Advance reprinted a claim attributed to a government bureau that a mound in Iowa yielded a skeleton that would have stood 7 feet 6 inches. The words were plain, the detail of bones crumbling in air direct. Then there is the familiar fade, a lack of follow-up, a file that doesn't hold more than a line or two. Farther west in Arizona, local papers in 1913 noted 8-foot forms coming out of the earth at Sycamore Creek and Walnut Creek, within months of each other. Names were printed. Finds spoke of a pattern that didn't care about state lines or rail schedules. In San Diego, a full 8-foot skeleton turned up in a burial cave with tools and woven cloth. It entered an official annual report as a fact placed in a tidy box. Later, the height was walked back as a mismeasure. No detailed re-exam surfaced to show the math. Occasionally a specimen reached a glass case. In 1895, an 8-foot 4-inch skeleton was bought for $500, labelled and shown for 13 years. People gawked, took notes, and left. Then an internal look called it gelatin, and the exhibit died with a single word. If that verdict was solid, why did it take more than a decade? If mistaken, how did it stand so long? The gap draws thought. The record falls quiet. Workers keep showing up on this map. Quarrymen in Mississippi, soldiers in California, cemetery crews in Ohio, a hobbyist on an island with an adding machine, a doctor whose office smells faintly of carbolic acid and dust. None of them talk like myth makers. They talk about weight, length, thickness, the way a jaw fits around a face like a mask, the way a rib cage gives 2 hands no leverage. They write numbers, not adjectives, and then they hand it all off. After that, it gets thin. You can follow the pins across hills that predate Roman roads and salt flats that keep secrets in white glare. The Midwest yields copper crescents and heavy spearheads near bodies large enough to wield them without strain. These are not the fragile bones of pituitary misfires that modern textbooks outline. They are dense, described as broad in proportion, even when centuries in the ground should have hollowed them out. Supporters suggest that consistency across places and decades matters. Critics counter that old newspapers like to tall tale when circulation needed sugar. The feeling shifts while you trace roots with a fingertip. Curiosity drains into a quiet unease as repetition builds. The words vary. The measurements do not by much. The cleanup is nearly always the same. Boxes, tags, a destination that becomes a fog. You're not looking at a rumour. You're looking at a footprint, the kind you only see when dawn light hits a field just right. It's big enough to register twice, then again 100 times, then so often you stop gasping and start counting. By now, it seems unhelpful to argue whether giants popped up once like a carnival trick. Giant skeletons didn't appear once in America. They appeared everywhere, if you judge by clippings, by museum cards, by the notes of doctors and curators who sign their names in ink darker than the photos that survive them. They were measured, they were boxed, they were sent to addresses we're told we can trust, and yet stand in a public gallery today and you will not see them lined along a wall. The absence is not proof, but it is a sensation you feel in your ribs. Let the frame widen. If this many bones were recorded from Missouri creeks to Catalina coves, from Ohio's mounds to Arizona's dry washes, and if a machine of crates and ledgers moved them into a single stream, then a different question pushes forward. Who were they? Not as a slogan, not as a monster of the week, but as a people with a history, a diet, a pattern of trade, a way to die and be buried with care. If the country is seeded with their echoes, then the answer is not small. The map waits, and so do the pins that haven't lit up yet. Cold air hangs in the storeroom where the doctor sets the femur on a wool blanket. The bone is smooth as riverstone under lamplight, pale with a faint honey tint from age. His fingers press into the shaft and don't meet the give he expects. It feels packed, as if the marrow were replaced with something denser than life ever needs. He tries to lift it with one hand and adjusts, both palms now under the weight. The wood table creaks. On the windowsill, a fly taps the glass and falls quiet. He lays a wooden ruler along the curve and whispers a number that doesn't match any chart in his head. You can almost hear the pencil scratch as he writes down measurements, then rubs the page with the side of his thumb to smudge the graphite. His coat smells faintly of clove oil and old linen. He tips the femur to the light and watches the cross-section at the break. The compact bone is thick like the side of a tool handle. The ring barely leaves room for a canal. He doesn't say, "wonder." He doesn't have to. The heft speaks for him. Medical training gives him a box to sort what he sees. Giants exist in textbooks as pathology. Pituitary growth, too much hormone. Bodies climb upward on bones gone long and thin. The heart strains. The joints complain early. Feet and hands keep growing after the plates should close. He has seen the photographs of modern tall men whose height came with fragile frames. He has read case notes where infection or heart failure ends the story before 30. When a face changes under excess hormone in adulthood, they call it acromegaly. The jaw juts a little, the brow thickens. But the skeleton remains a stretched version of us, not a scaled one. That's the rule, printed in clean type. He lifts the femur again and slides his thumb along the ridge where muscle once anchored. The surface rises higher than his own radius bone. It's not grace, it's leverage. He sets the femur beside a normal specimen from his teaching cabinet. The difference isn't length alone. The normal bone looks delicate by comparison. He taps each with a knuckle. One gives a soft wooden note, the other gives nothing back but mass. Across the room, wrapped in sackcloth, the skull waits with a jaw that can swallow a palm. He turns it in his lap like fruit he cannot name. The teeth tell a separate story. 2 neat arcs on the top, 2 below, interleaved in a way he doesn't find in his anatomy book. Critics counter that jaws can sprout accessory teeth around molars or canines, a quirk some dentists still note. But this isn't random crowding. This looks organised, as if a second row grew with the first. Some whisper that reports like this exaggerate. The doctor rubs his finger along the enamel and feels uniform smoothness, where he expects odd angles and misfit roots. The skull wall itself feels like boiled leather hardened in a mould, not the thin, brittle shell he handles in class. Physics sits on his shoulder like a strict teacher. As a thing grows larger, weight climbs faster than the area that supports it. The square cube law is the line everyone in the room knows by feel, even if they never say the term. Bigger bodies fall out of balance because mass wins that contest. To stand tall, the frame has to thicken faster than the height rises. Long and thin fails. Thick and short survives. He measures thickness again, and the numbers argue for scale, not stretch. The pieces don't look bowed by a lifetime of strain. They look built for it. A rib crosses his hands and he cannot squeeze it toward the centre. It might once have circled a chest large enough for 2 adults to fit shoulder to shoulder. When he sets it down, the edge leaves a shallow dent in the blanket. He searches his memory for cases where the rib cage distends. Lung disease sometimes deforms a chest. Certain disorders broaden bones, but those bring brittleness and irregular shape. This curvature is smooth, like a ship hull. In his ledger, he notes the estimated cranial capacity. It comes back high, not a small leap above the mean, but far outside the bell curve he learned to trust. He keeps the number to himself for now. Others dismiss numbers like that as errors made by a farm doctor without a proper lab. He tightens the strap around the skull to steady it and makes a second estimate. The pencil marks deepen. What makes the scene strange isn't one shocking feature. It's the stack of mismatches. Reports from other places mention femurs that feel heavier than any modern bone of the same length, even though centuries should have wicked moisture out and left them lighter. There are mentions of skulls with circumference measurements so high they make hats seem like toys, jaws wide enough to pass over a contemporary man's face, not as a trick of angle, but with witnesses placing their own heads inside. The doctor has read clippings about such finds, and he has nodded politely at the exaggerations of rural papers. Now his palms rest on something that echoes those lines too precisely to ignore. When you compare this to known medical cases, the pattern tilts in the light and its meaning sharpens. Pathological height gives us brittle bone and stress marks. It gives us early death and deformed cartilage. It rarely gives us a skeleton that looks built like infrastructure. The bone before him doesn't seem to have been taxed to failure. It seems overbuilt, as if failure was designed out of the system before the body ever stood. He pulls a small scale closer and tests a fragment from the broken shaft. The reading surprises him. For a moment he wonders if the old scale spring stuck from the cold. He flicks it with a fingernail and tries again. The number barely moves. He jots down the weight and adds a question mark. The mark feels louder than the number. In papers from Ohio, there are notes about mounds that gave up skulls with walls thick as armour. In Nevada, in caves mined for guano, workers brought out sandals so big even the tallest men in the camp laughed and set them aside like props until hair the colour of rust turned the laughter down. On the California coast, on an island with wind that tastes like salt, inventories list skeletons measuring past what modern sport celebrates, then taper off where the tallest entries should continue. Across localities, the report card reads the same: weight where you don't expect it, density where you'd plan reinforcement, dental patterns that refuse to behave like accidents. Supporters suggest this points to a separate branch of humanity, not a medical outlier. Something built for a rougher world with megafauna on the menu and colder mornings than we know. A hybrid thread woven into our line, perhaps, if you listen to older tales about unions between skywatchers and earthborn wives. Others dismiss that as storybook thinking layered onto bones that someone mismeasured. The doctor knows he stands in a room, not a myth. But he also knows the body keeps a strict logic. He has learned that logic by palpating, by cutting, by listening with simple tools. The logic here tells him height alone isn't the headliner, proportion is. He looks again at the square cube problem and pictures a life lived on those levers and pulleys. To climb a slope, the hips and knees need more than length, they need cross-section. To swing a tool with control, the shoulder needs space and attachment points. To breathe under effort, the chest needs volume without collapse. The bones in front of him deliver that design in matter, not theory. If someone tried to build a taller human without redesigning the frame, the result would fail under its own ambition. What he handles looks like someone solved for load. He thinks about the lifespan question. Modern, towering men in photographs often lean on canes early. Their medical files grow thick with notes. Accounts of these older skeletons rarely mention deformity or signs of chronic stress. It's not proof. It's a silence where he expects noise. He writes the word robust and then lines it out, replacing it with dense, less boastful, more precise. His own caution calms him. Skeptics have a list he respects. Newspaper errors, measuring tapes pulled along curves, exaggerations sold to boost circulation, farmers mistaking animal sections for human ones. He has no quarrel with sensible doubt, but his fingertips keep returning to the ridge along the femur where the great muscles once pulled. You can't fake that kind of anchor across the whole body. One hoax can slip through a town, 100 matching details across states start to feel like a pattern. If this is pathology, it is a kind that rewrites the outline, not a gland's mischief stretching a child into a fragile tower, but a plan that thickens every support. The jaw reads as a tool. The ribs read as a barrel built to hold a larger fire. The skull reads as a helmet grown in place. He leans back and lets the lamplight find its own level on the bone. Some whisper that this points to engineering of a sort, not in a laboratory sense, but in the slow workshop of generations selecting for strength over grace. Supporters suggest hybridization, an old mixing that left rare pockets of size with structure to match. Critics counter that human biology doesn't wander that far without leaving clear genetic breadcrumbs in the living. The doctor doesn't have a lab to test for such crumbs. He has weight, thickness, curve, and feel. Sometimes that's enough to know when the tool in your hand wasn't meant for your hand. The ledger grows heavier with each number. He lists the femur's length and notes that it surpasses most modern records not just in inches but in cross-sectional area. He sketches the skull in profile and marks the double arc of teeth without comment. He sets a rib across the page to get its span right, then notes the distance between costal grooves where nerves once ran. The pencil catches in the paper as if the page itself resists the shape. He knows about the law that says taller bodies should fail. It's the same law that keeps children from building towers of blocks past a certain height before they tip. These bones answer with their own law: build thicker where the load demands it. The doctor has no name for the species that wrote that solution into anatomy. He has to settle for a hunch that he is not holding a random outlier. He is holding a blueprint. Outside, the street gives a dull roll of wagon wheels. The sound fades. He lifts the femur one last time and eases it back into its crate. The lid fits with a hollow knock. He signs his name on a tag and ties it with twine, hand steady now that the work is done. The room feels warmer, though the window still leaks cold. If these weren't just tall men, then what were they built for? The thought arrives and won't leave. It sits beside another question that tightens the air. If a body like this solves the physics of size, where did all the solved bodies go? The tag flutters until it lies flat, and the crate waits for a destination that turns bones into rumours, as easily as a locked door turns rooms into myths. The railcar breathes a metal chill as dawn fog slicks the couplers. You can hear the slow rhythm of wheels taking up weight. Crate stamped with a crisp blue oval sits strapped under canvas. The ink still tacky where someone pressed the seal. Smithsonian Institution. A porter drags a gloved hand over the stencils, reads the towns out loud in a bored drawl. Steelville, Lovelock, Miamisburg, and gives one crate a soft kick to test its balance. Sawdust leaks from a corner seam and clings to his cuff. The car door slides shut and the world narrows to wood, iron, and the steady click that carries bones toward the Potomac. By the time those crates reach Washington, the day has warmed. The marble glows pale as milk. Inside, the air is cooler and smells faintly of paste, old varnish and linen twine. A clerk at a high desk licks a finger and flips ledger pages, his wrist turning the same careful arc with every entry. Received, catalogue pending. Received, subject to review. He dips the nib again and notes the same destination for each box with a practiced flourish. Anthropology. The handwriting is graceful, the labels are plain, the journey feels official, which is another word for invisible. The Smithsonian began with a promise to increase and diffuse knowledge. That mandate still hangs like a motto carved in stone. It was designed as a national attic, a place where discoveries could rest inside dry air and careful order rather than decay in barns and basements. Centralization was the virtue. One vault, one catalogue, one set of hands guiding the story into shape. But the same funnel that protects can also narrow what the public sees. Visibility turns into a choice, and choices turn into history. Walk a slow loop through a gallery and you feel the strength of that model. Glass cases, clean labels, a path that flows. What you don't feel is the weight of decisions you never meet. The trays that stay in drawers, the crates never uncrated, the findings that exist as numbers in a ledger and nothing more. Museums are not closets, they are filters. Some items pass through to light, others remain behind the partition, preserved but not present, like a song sung in another room. In the late 1800s, that filter grew powerful. Newspapers told readers what to do when something strange turned up under a fieldstone or inside a cave wall. Send it to Washington. Doctors echoed the advice with a gentle civic pride. Farmers wrapped bones in burlap and added cedar shavings to cushion the long ride. It was a new American ritual. The gold rush had taught people how to pack fortunes in wood. Now they packed remains with the same care, believing the capital would answer questions their towns could not. And so a bottleneck formed. A copper-tagged jawbone from a mound in Ohio, a long femur from a Missouri creek bed, a skull from a desert cave. each entered the same system. The Bureau of Ethnology, tucked beneath the larger roof, handled much of the traffic that tied to America's ancient past. Not in the field most days, but at desks. Ledger books absorbed stories like sponges. Field notes arrived with smudged margins and measurements in pencil. Memos added a layer of judgment in tidy script. Those decisions often reflected the era's assumptions as much as the evidence itself. Inside that bureaucracy, two ideas tugged at the map. Diffusionism offered that cultures exchange, borrow and share over long distances. Isolationism argued that societies flower on their own, each continent a closed garden. The Bureau leaned in one direction then the other. Over time, isolation took the stronger seat. Discoveries that hinted at far-flung contact, or at populations that didn't fit the tidy family tree, met quiet resistance. No formal decree had to be stamped for a narrative to harden. It just needed a gate with a patient guard. Here's where the logistics do their work. The Smithsonian's collection swelled faster than catalogues could keep pace. Tagging systems shifted, rooms moved, one curator retired, another refiled. Crates were opened for a look, then resealed when priorities changed. A slip miscopied a number by a digit. A skull stored under a general label, Human Remains Midwest, lost the detail that once made it interesting to a specific eye. Critics counter that this reads like negligence. Others dismiss it as the normal mess of a big institution. Either way, the effect is the same. Invisible is indistinguishable from absent to anyone outside the walls. Walk the back corridors in your mind. The light is steady, the temperature low. Shelving runs in rows so long that perspective squeezes them to a point. A technician wheels a cart, pauses, and scribbles a note, then slides a tray into a slot with a muted clack. On the paper, accession ID, date, division, status. No drama, just process. It's easy to forget how decisive process can be. Consider the moment a crate from a rural dig arrives at the receiving dock. A worker pops the nails with a pry bar, peels canvas, and threads fingers through sawdust. Two jaw halves, a cluster of molars, a femur, stray fragments. The initial shape seems unusual, heavy, thick, outside the bell curve, but documentation is sparse. The field notes are enthusiastic. The inspector's training nudges toward caution. He writes preliminary assessment. Atypical but indeterminate. Recommends storage until further review. In a system built to protect, until further review can mean tomorrow, or indefinitely. The Bureau's paperwork carried more force than a shovel in many cases. A line in a report could reduce an excavation's most provocative find to a footnote. A choice of words, indigenous, large specimen, irregular, could compress the range of possibilities into something easier to dismiss. It wasn't always done with ill will. Sometimes it was simple discomfort with uncertainty. Good institutions love explanation. Anomalies are hard to explain without disturbing other parts of the chart. Supporters suggest that once isolationist thinking took the wheel, anything that supported long-range contact or separate lineages met the same fate. Shelf first, silence second. The institution didn't need to burn evidence to make it go away. It needed only to take custody and slow the flow of visibility. Newspaper excitement cooled without new images or lectures to feed it. County memories faded when nothing returned from Washington but a courteous note. Remember the people in this story. A small-town doctor with a pocket tape and steady hands, a miner who lifted a sandal and found it wider than his forearm, a farmer who wrote handle with care across a fruit crate repurposed for bone. They did what the culture asked. They entrusted the bones to a place meant to keep them safe. Months later, the reply would arrive. Received, understudy, no further details at present. Plight is a kind of finality when paired with time. Inside the institution, the scale of the archive creates its own weather. When you hold 10,000 artifacts in one wing, a single crate is hard to track, even if it matters to someone far away. Add the human layer. Turnover, budgets, shifting priorities, and the fog thickens. Critics counter that missing catalogue numbers and vague labels feel convenient when the finds in question challenge established timelines. Some whisper that mislabeling isn't random at all. The line between accident and intention thins when it always leans one way. What does custodianship mean if only a narrow stream reaches daylight? A museum can preserve an object perfectly, down to the moisture content and pH, and still erase it from culture by reducing it to a data point in a room no one visits. It's a soft erasure, an almost bureaucratic fade. The object exists yet vanishes from memory. Over years, the absence feels natural, like a river that changed course long ago. Few remember the original channel unless you show them a map with missing lines. Inside the Bureau of Ethnology's files, patterns settled in like dust. Oral histories that didn't fit standard models were logged and set aside. Measurements outside expected ranges drew extra scrutiny that often ended in dismissal. Papers that might have argued for broader connections across the Americas met a cooler reception as isolationist thought shaped policy. The frame narrowed, and with it the vocabulary. A 7.5-foot skeleton became unusually tall. Double rows of teeth became dental anomalies without further inquiry. Even if those terms were cautious rather than censorious, the public heard nothing at all. There is a way to read this that requires no cloak and dagger plot. Big systems default to safe choices. Safe choices tend to favour existing models. Existing models rely on predictable evidence. Anything that strains predictability waits in the queue. The queue is long. Somewhere in there, time does what time does. Files cool. Names lose context. A crate shifts to a lower shelf to make room for a new conservation project, and the older problem dissolves into the background hum. But listen carefully as the train's rhythm returns in your head. Those crates didn't end up in 10 different archives with 10 different curators and 10 different philosophies. They arrived in one place that became the arbiter of visibility for a nation's deep past. A single point of control simplifies logistics. It also concentrates the power to decide what lives in public memory. If one building holds the atlas, it also holds the eraser. A curator leans over a table at day's end and replaces a muslin cover over a skull. He aligns the edges as if tucking someone in. Then he writes a small note to himself, follow up with osteology on unusual cranial thickness, and slides it under a paperweight cut from glass. He means to return to it. He will, maybe. Or the note will ride a stack to a drawer and live there for years as funding shifts to other projects. When a colleague scans the index later, the words unusual and cranial might not spark the same care. In this light, suppression needs no whispered pact. It needs only paperwork and patience. When discoveries must pass through one gate, the gate decides how crowded the path becomes, how swiftly it moves, and which travellers wait under the eaves. The public sees what reaches the front steps. The rest resides within reach of a key few possess. That is the architecture we stand inside tonight. Marble and mission on the outside, shelves, ledgers, and human judgment within. If bones that strain our models entered this house, they entered a system well designed to keep them safe, and just as able to keep them unseen. Which leaves us in a quiet corridor, listening to the aftering of those steel wheels, and wondering what exactly was carried into the vault and left there to grow cold while the story outside set like plaster. Gaslight flickers against varnished wood and glass. You stand in a corridor that smells faintly of oil, paper, and wet wool. Footsteps soften as carpets swallow sound. Down the hall, a map room glows. Pins bristle across a hand-drawn United States, tight clusters along river valleys, the Mississippi like a spine. Two figures lean close over the cartography. One is broad-shouldered, coat open, sleeve pinned neatly where an arm should be. The other adjusts wire-rimmed glasses and marks a date in the corner with a slow, practiced motion. Their coats steam gently from winter air, and a clerk closes the door with care, as if drafts might scatter the past. John Wesley Powell studies a line of coloured pins marching through the Ohio country. The explorer's face carries canyon sun that never quite left him, but his voice is low now, almost administrative in its cadence. Across from him, Cyrus Thomas arranges field notes into columns. He licks his thumb, turns a page, and the thin paper rustles like dry grass. Between them, a stack of crates manifests as a list. Labels from distant counties, mound numbers, heights in inches, objects that never enter the room, yet weigh on the table as surely as stone. Let the frame widen. Before this office and its neat pens, Powell had floated through badlands and basalt, gauging river drop by sound and eddy. Some accounts suggest he once entertained broad exchange, ideas moving with ships and winds, traders crossing oceans before charts were standard, skills carried in memory across water, trail dust hardened into authority when Congress gave him a bureau and a budget. The same man who listened to canyon echoes now listened to committee rooms. With that shift, approval became a lever. A nod opened a museum case. A shake of the head sealed a crate for the basement. Thomas works by accumulation. He writes letters to county seats, to surveyors, to pastors with mounds near their parsonages. Replies arrive in uneven script. Some bundle photographs under twine. Others enclose rubbings, beadwork lists, or the crisp measurements of a doctor, proud to send Washington proper figures. On a low shelf, reports begin to stand in ranks. Field sketches, burial counts, artifact lists, all reduced to tables that show range and median. A winter passes. Another. The piles grow, the edges align, and loose legends harden into office policy one stamped envelope at a time. While field men clean shovels under pump handles, Washington composes sentences that carry weight. The new view leans local. It prefers mounds as recent indigenous handiwork. No foreign architects, no ancient astronomers, no colossi tucked beneath earthen domes. Others dismiss this as tidy, even comforting. Critics counter that this neatness arrived just when reports turned most unruly. Thick skulls, outsized jaws, measurements that stride past norms like long steps through grass. In the map room, though, unruliness becomes a column marked anomalous, then thins to a line, then to a footnote. Night settles earlier in 1881 than anyone expects. Clerks stay late. The inkwell grows a skin. A secretary opens a ledger, frowns at a smudged number, and rewrites it on a clean page. Pencils dull to stubs. The system coalesces almost of its own accord, as systems do. Standard forms, uniform headings, a habit of filing where pattern is preferred. If a report claims skull walls like armour, the marginalia suggests robust type. If a doctor swears to double dentition, the return letter replies with supernumerary teeth are common anomalies. Each reply is polite. Each is a small hinge that turns a door toward daylight the institution approves. By 1894, Thomas's synthesis arrives bound in black brass letters pressed into the cover. The smell of fresh glue rides the air. Here is the vista from the lamplit halls, mounds compiled into typologies, timelines calibrated, excavations summarized with a voice that feels final. University chairs adopt its confidence and pass it to students who will teach classrooms that will visit museum cases that will echo its choices. Newspaper editors, grateful for clean lines, lift paragraphs and set them in type. Meanwhile, reports that drift sideways, unexpected bone lengths, cranial cavities beyond the usual curve, receive gentler verbs, a cushion of maybe. The shock softens into unconfirmed, then fades to unlikely. In those narrow margins, something subtle occurs. The tone around the old 19th century blur of mysterious builders cools. It does not argue, it refiles. The drawer slides closed with a practical click. Field men still sweat in summer dirt. County clerks still stamp receipts. The nation still sends oddities east. But the phrasing shifts. Towering becomes tall. Giant becomes large. A jaw that could mask a face becomes robust mandible. Those who once mailed heights with pride read new summaries that place local craft where they had felt older hands, and they adjust their memory to match the printed page. You trace a finger along the map pins and feel the quiet force of simplification. There is relief in it. A continent grows easier to explain when all roads lead to a small set of conclusions. Supporters suggest clarity was overdue, that mixing mounds with myths blurred credit due to living tribes. There is fairness in that caution. Yet watch how the apparatus catches more than hoax. It also nets the awkward. When typed labels replace handwritten astonishments, outliers stop being problems to solve. They become errors to eliminate. In a back office, a clerk boxes a bundle marked MISC. The twine bites into the cardboard edges. He logs a number in a ledger and files the note under a category that did not exist last year. Across town, a professor revises a lecture. He deletes a paragraph on extraordinary bone finds and replaces it with a line about observer error. His hand hesitates over the paper, then moves on. Habits form this way, not with proclamations, but with small comforts repeated until they feel like obvious truth. The split, two histories choosing separate paths, does not arrive with fanfare. It arrives as a change in temperature. Before, newspapers told of mounds that shamed Roman numerals and bones that made a grown man look slight. After, headlines stress recentness, locality, modest scope. Field photos that once scaled femurs beside farmhands vanish in favour of baskets and pottery. The older accounts take on a tint, as if they belong to a gullible era that loved a yarn. The newer voice prefers restraint. It irons the wrinkle until the cloth lies flat. At a window, Powell turns his sleeve pin and looks toward the mall where fog clings over lawns. He knows storms. He has slept under cliffs while rivers spoke in flood tones. Administrative storms are different. Their flood is paperwork. One directive reorders a shelf. One shelf changes a catalogue. One catalogue feeds a curriculum. Some whisper that a door closed in this epoch. Not slammed, but latched. Once latched, even honest hands found it hard to open. Thomas completes a circuit through verification. He writes back to a county seat and asks for bones to be remeasured with a different rule. A new number arrives, smaller this time. He trusts the second figure more. Perhaps the first saw what it expected. Perhaps the second saw what the forms preferred. The point is not deceit. It is gravity. In a building designed to collect all that the nation learns, some knowledge sinks faster than others. The machinery of narrative control does not need villains. It needs desks, deadlines, and a taste for coherence. Exhibits prefer a through line. Funders prefer consensus. Young scholars find safer footing when their footnotes echo established texts. And so a review process becomes a field of invisible fences. Step inside them and your work moves. Step outside and your letter returns with polite thanks and no travel budget. The fences hum at a pitch few remark on. The office plants thrive. The map pins hold their ground. There is an argument here that never reaches argument form. One side says, let the facts accrete until only the clean ones remain. Do not gild the past with roaming giants and borrowed astronomies. The other wonders why long bones shrink precisely when oversight grows, why outsized crania are robust only in older ledgers, why double rows of teeth arrive in crates and exit as footnote cautions. The hallway air feels cool. A clock marks the hour with a soft brass throat. By the time the thud of Thomas's bound report settles into stacks across the country, normal has been reset. Teachers hold the book like a pathfinder. Visitors stand before vitrines that explain mounds with charts and reconstructions. They learn about village life, trade, and practice. They do not hear the older phrases. The record is not destroyed. It is muffled under newer explanations that carry the scent of authority. If you listen closely, older words still whisper under the varnish. Most do not bend an ear. The crates continue to arrive. Labels read Missouri, Wisconsin, West Virginia, California. Some open to reveal artifacts that fit pre-selected cases. Some open to material that resists polite scripts. Those go to research. Research moves slowly. A curator writes uncertain context and sets a tag in careful cursive. Another adds deteriorated. A third suggests repatriation for items that meet criteria. It is all earnest. It is all rule-bound. Yet the practical effect is the same. The least convenient items fade from gallery lights to study drawers to inventories that only staff see. A calm irony threads through it. The institution built to keep America's memory intact proves deft at choosing which memories deserve daylight. That choice may protect living communities from myths that deny their ancestors' skill, and that is a worthy guardrail. It may also file down edges that could widen our timeline, if only to test an old rumour against new methods. Both can be true in the same building. The hallway keeps its even temperature. The pencil sharpener grinds softly. The day's mail drops with a papery sigh. Outside, the Capitol's lamps blink on one by one. Inside, Powell signs a memo that strengthens a guideline, and Thomas drafts a paragraph that will travel for decades. If a county coroner sends an enthusiastic note about a mandible the size of a horseshoe, the reply will be courteous and firm. Encourage careful measurement. Encourage context. Encourage skepticism about extravagant claims. Between the lines, discourage the appetite for the extraordinary. Channel it into safer channels. The current, once established, carries the next generation toward shore. Earlier in the century, journals and gazettes published breathless notes about bronze ornaments on 8-foot skeletons, about palisades and engineered embankments. Now those echoes sound quaint. The phrase giant race is treated as a rustic misread. The motive can be noble, to give proper credit to native builders without layering in outsiders that never existed. Yet the timing is too neat for some. Just as the heap of strange measurements rises, the threshold for what counts as admissible rises too. The coincidence itches like wool. In this light, the divergence is simple. One stream of history runs through catalogued artifacts, repeatable typologies, and a map that looks tidy under lamplight. The other lives in mismatched boxes, local clippings, and the memory of farmhands who lifted skulls with 2 hands. Which stream survives depends on who has keys to the doors, and whose language sounds most responsible. Responsibility in this era speaks softly and files well. You linger by the table where the map lies under weights. Shadows from the window grids slice the Ohio Valley. The pins do not glow, but they draw the eye anyway. There is a sense not of emptiness but of design, an arrangement that selects, prunes, and presents. If a different arrangement were allowed, the same facts might pull a different picture from the same soil. The question is not whether a single decision erased a people. It is how a suite of decisions, each small and defensible, accumulated into a story that leaves larger footprints out of frame. The hallway's hush is friendly, the kind that tells you the work will wait for morning. Still, a thread remains in the air. If one report could codify what counts as serious, and one office could steer 1,000 museum labels toward one line, then absence begins to look crafted, not accidental. And once you see the craft, the next door matters more than the last. Because behind it rests the place where crated bones and careful paperwork meet a kind of daylight that never reaches the galleries. The air is cool down here, almost damp, the kind of chill that lingers in paper and wood. A single bulb hums above a concrete aisle, its cone of light falling across rows of crates that run farther than your eyes can keep count. Pine boards show their age, hairline splits, rusted nails, stenciled letters softened by time and dust. Inked shipping labels hang by brittle string. You can still make out towns and rivers, Paducah, Chillicothe, San Pedro, each name a breadcrumb from an excavation that once stirred a neighbourhood into talk. Somewhere, deeper in the stacks, a stamp lands with the same tired rhythm it has kept for years. The clerk at the desk does not look up. His sleeves are rolled, his hands stained with carbon and oil from the press. He flips a form, feeds it into the metal throat of the date device, and the block drops with a flat thud. Received. He turns to another sheet, initials a margin, knuckles a crate tag that reads Bones. Anthropological priority. The sound in the room is steady and unhurried. Paper sliding, boxes shifting, the small scrape of a pencil, as someone writes a number that might mean anything or nothing in 20 years. Follow one file because you have to start somewhere. A shipment manifest from Kentucky lists Crump's Cave. Coffins removed from a limestone vault and itemised by length down to fractions of an inch. Names are attached in neat cursive, likely the people who paid for the wagons or loaned their teams. It comes with a sketch. 2 long boxes, cross-braced, marked fragile along the slats. The ledger notes arrival on a Wednesday, storm forecast, temporary storage in East Bay Sea. That is the last complete line. The next page flips to a different shipment. The cave entry never receives its catalogue number, never migrates to display notes, never appears again. Another path threads west to the islands off California. An inventory under the name Ralph Glidden lists skulls and long bones recovered over multiple seasons. Measurements repeat on the forms, numbers you want to read twice, then once again. An acquisition receipt lists a sum and a transfer. The paper trail shows a move to a new facility, then a short memo about select objects retained for study. Photographs once highlighted the tallest exhibits in Glidden's own rooms on Avalon. The transfer should have brought more visibility. Instead, the tallest entries grow spare on the page. A line is drawn through 2 catalogue codes. A marginal note uses a word that looks like relocate or reclassify. The script a little rushed, like a clerk catching up at the end of a long day. Watch the machinery work at scale. It is late afternoon on a siding under a sky that smells faintly of coal. Freight boxes sit with chalk numbers on their ends. 2 men lift a crate by its rope handles and feel the weight shift as straw settles around something irregular inside. Another man nails the lid with practiced taps. The foreman waves toward a rail car and a narrow ramp, and the crate slides forward with a hollow bump. Each box is bound for a different hall, bureau, or storage annex. If you lean in, you can hear the quiet language of logistics, routing codes, transfer slips, initials, and how easily a wrong digit can send a shipment down a corridor no one visits. In an office with a frosted glass door, a clerk files a report that uses careful language. It notes receipt. It notes temporary housing in a secure area. It mentions preparation for analysis pending personnel availability. Nothing is inaccurate, yet nothing offers a later reader a handhold. Another clerk stamps a batch of return correspondence with polite phrases about current capacity and research priorities. The letters never say no. They never promise a date either. The system breathes with a bureaucrat's calm. A door opens to a corridor where it is cooler still. Shelves carry boxes 2 deep. The labels speak in half-truths. Native remains, ethnographic, artifact, misc. Some crates are tied with wire and old canvas straps, a habit from wartime austerity that never really left. On one box the strap has sagged, and a corner of straw peeks out, seeded with dust. A pencil mark across the top gives a height in feet and inches. If you try the lid, it does not move. The lid has been painted shut. You keep following case files not because each one resolves, but because the pattern is easier to hold when the names stay specific. A river town sends a wooden jaw claimed to be large enough to encircle a man's face. The crate arrives. The clerk records that the mandible appears oversized. A physiologist is copied on a memo, then never replies. A year later, a shelf list marks the item as under review, provenance uncertain. A decade on, the index card is replaced with a typed label that classifies it as pathological specimen and reroutes it to a department that deals in abnormalities. The next audit will find nothing in that drawer at all, only a vacant slot where the card once rested. Inside the stacking of paper and wood live the laws that keep the gears turning and sometimes allow them to grind. The museum's legal position sits slightly aside from the frameworks that govern other collections. It is not a courtroom revelation, more a footnote most people skip. That footnote allows bones to be catalogued, or not, to be retained with minimal notice, or transferred and later cleared from a ledger as part of routine collections management. When advocates push for disclosure, they find the language is often general. The reporting timelines do not bind. The oversight that might force a search across multiple vaults can be interpreted as advisory. Supporters suggest the office is overwhelmed by volume and by the old habit of intake before interpretation. Others dismiss claims of misdoing and point at mundane causes, mislabeling, water damage, records lost during a move. Those things happen. They happen a lot in institutions that sprawl across buildings and decades. It is one thing to dismiss a rumour. It is another to explain why it endures when names, dates and receipts populate the early pages with ink that has barely faded. A storage elevator, doors shut with a soft, heavy seal, and the descent blurs floors like chapters. The basement hum deepens into a lower note. Down here, the clock on the wall keeps time without numbers. A registrar lifts a lid, weighs a bone by hand, and writes 27.5 in a small square on a form. The bone goes back into the straw. The lid closes. The label gets a neat line under the number. If you stand still after the registrar leaves, the room returns to its habitual state. A quiet so deep you can hear the light buzzing. In another aisle, a pair of student assistants lean over a catalogue book bound in buckram. They whisper about a shipment from the 1890s that lists half a dozen long skeletons from a Midwestern mound. The line item ends with a check mark, no cage location. They pull a drawer and find glass plate negatives from the era, men in hat brims, a measuring rod propped beside a rib cage. The next sleeve is empty but labelled accordingly. The assistants trade a look they don't put in their report. By the river, in yet another memory of motion, a crate is lowered by rope into a warehouse dock at dusk. An agent signs the delivery form with a small flourish. The crate lingers on the dock overnight, then moves to a holding area when the morning crew arrives. 2 weeks later, after a regional office writes to inquire, a reply goes out, "Specimen received. Under evaluation, further updates to follow." No one is lying. No one is telling the whole of it either, partly because the whole requires time the office doesn't have, and partly because the chain of custody has already braided itself into something a single letter cannot unweave. Across these cases, the same verbs repeat: receive, transfer, reclassify, consolidate, deaccession, dispose. None of them need to carry drama to erase a path. A misfit item can be placed with anomalies and later cleared during a policy update that sees anomalies as liabilities. A specimen deemed sensitive can be shielded from public lists. A curator can retire, and the inheritor of the cabinet can decide which drawers still matter. That is not a story of villains. It is a story of systems that prefer smooth edges. Critics counter that the omissions cluster around the same kind of find, and that coincidence has limits. The biggest bones prove hardest to locate. The boldest measurements seem to shrink when rewritten in later summaries. The photos that survive often show the older language plainly, height marks, scale sticks, but the captions soften the claims. The official line may frame them as misidentifications, exaggerations, or artifacts of poor recording. The record falls quiet at the moment a reader might want clarity most. Walk the locked corridor that guards the archival room where the oldest ledgers live. The temperature bites a little. You sign a log and request a ledger by number. The attendant disappears into the rows and returns with a book that could be a family Bible. Heavy, slow to open, its paper like cloth. You scan columns. You find an entry you recognise from a newspaper that ran a century ago. The names match. The measurements are there, and then the hand changes mid-line. Below, a note reads moved to holding, awaiting review. Next page, a different site. You look up as a cart squeaks by, and a gust of colder air closes the cover as if the room itself wants the book to rest. Even in the stories people tell, there are steady human rhythms. The donor who writes once a year to ask about the crate he helped load. The small town paper that runs an anniversary piece on the day a farm field opened to reveal bones longer than any farmer there had seen. The museum's reply stays courteous. The farm's memory grows soft. The paper's archive moves to microfilm, then to a server that drops a chunk of dates during a migration. Familiar after rings. Each one means less on its own than they do together. None of this requires a cloak and dagger. The architecture of disappearance can be ordinary. It can look like a form left on a desk over a weekend and a box stored 3 racks too high. It can sound like a new policy about what can be kept in open stacks. It can feel like the weight of a lid you lift and set down, promising yourself you will return with help. And then summer turns to fall, and the help gets assigned elsewhere. Some whisper that, at times, bones were cleared during space shortages, reduced to measurements and photographs, then to only the numbers. Others dismiss this as hearsay. In the absence of perfect files, the mind fills gaps. It is what minds do, but the gaps care less about motive than result. They widen a bit more each year until memory starts to rely on clippings and rumours, while the crates settle deeper into dust. The strongest sensations here are small ones. The dry feel of straw dust on your fingers after you lift a lid to peek. The rasp of a file folder pulled from a tight drawer. The smell of old rope. A bent nail in a crate lip that snags a sleeve. These are not the details of a myth. They are the texture of a place that has learned to keep its head down while it grows. You walk out past the desk where the stamping started. The clerk is on another stack of forms now, hands moving in the same practice loop. You want to ask about one entry. He nods and points to a closet where older logs sit in grey boxes. The boxes are labelled, but not in a way that helps. The day closes, and the bulb overhead gives a tired flicker. The room dims a little, and the hum lowers with it. When you reach the alley, the air's warmer, and the city noise has a different pitch. Inside, the crates set with their words and weights and missing lines. Outside, people go home. It would be easy to call the absence a riddle and leave it at that. But the story is less a riddle than a slow fade. The bones were real long enough to be lifted, measured, crated, shipped. Their numbers were penciled in the margins. Then, in the spaces where a museum might place a label or a case, only paperwork remained. The pattern tilts in the light and its meaning sharpens. The next chapter does not hunt boxes. It watches how, year by year, the language that once described the giants was trimmed until there was nothing left to argue with at all. Cold rain taps canvas over a fairground tent in upstate New York, 1869. Lantern light warms the damp air, sweet with tobacco and wet wool. You hand a man 50 cents and he snaps the ticket from your palm. Inside, boards creak. The crowd leans in around a trench cut from the earth itself, where a 10-foot figure lies on its back, ribs ridged like a whale's. A preacher whispers a verse under his breath. A farmhand takes his hat off, as if he's in church, not a tent pitched on a field. The giant stone skin looks pitted like time chewed it. A boy pokes his head between shoulders and stares. The man on the dais swears it's a wonder. Newspapers outside shout the same thing in fat type. Reporters count coins, then copy lines from the banner. Petrified man, ancient figure, proof of old days. You can taste the pitch in the air and feel the floorboards answer every footstep. For a few days the world fits inside that tent, and the crowd sways to wonder like it's music. Then a confession leaks. The figure was carved from gypsum. Acid and ink gave it age. The applause turns to talk, then to laughter with a bitter edge. The lesson is quiet and messy. A spectacle can fool a whole town. The tent comes down, but its after ring lingers. When you hear giant bones again, your hand moves to your wallet a little slower. Others dismiss it now without a glance. The Cardiff show planted a seed. Not just doubt, but a habit. If one marvel turns to plaster, maybe all do. That habit spreads the way damp spreads along a canvas seam. Let the frame widen to the blue light of our age. You scroll in bed and a thumbnail hooks your eye. An excavator bucket beside a skeleton the size of a bus. A dig crew points as if it's real. It's crisp, dramatic, satisfying in the way movie posters are. You feel the tug for a second. Then the pixels give it away. Shadows don't match. Bones too clean. Teeth too regular. Within hours it's debunked again. Yet the same image pops up on a cousin's feed, then in a forum halfway across the world, stripped of the fake sticker, fresh as new paint. Digital smoke fills the room. Hoaxes come cheap and fast now. A keyboard can sculpt a giant faster than a chisel ever could. Supporters suggest some of this noise isn't coordinated, it's just easy attention. Critics counter that ease builds a shield where doubt hardens into habit. Either way, the effect lands the same way it did under that old tent. You look at a new claim and your brow sets. The burden climbs onto the back of the claim itself. Even when a story carries details that feel grounded, it swims in a pool thick with trickery. Down in the archives, there's another tone entirely. Handwriting leans in neat lines. A county doctor signs his name in iron gall ink. Femur length, 28 inches. Measurements, not exclamation points. The paper smells faintly of dust and a hint of vinegar, the way old files do. A clerk notes a catalogue number that fades at the edges. No filters, no dramatic angles, just numbers and names. Even if you don't know the full story, you can feel its weight, like holding a tool that still fits the hand it was made for. Now set that against the Instagram giants. Snap. Perfect light. A skeleton posed like a movie prop. Ribs splayed in a neat oval. No root marks, no soil stain, no wear on the edges. You can see the brush strokes of a composite if you lean in close. The older files and the new photos live on different planets. Two categories emerge, and they drag at each other like magnets flipped to repel. One is slow, dull to a modern eye, heavy with dates. The other is thrilling, snackable, and hollow as a drum. Back in California a century ago, a man named Ralph Glidden sold tickets to his finds on Catalina Island. He catalogued bones by the tray and the case. He posed for photos with skulls balanced on stands, height rods in frame. Some entries list individuals over 7 feet. The rooms he built look like curiosity shops more than museums. That is the knot. Did he hold real bones? The record says he did. Did he also love applause too much? The record says that too. His methods invite doubt, and that doubt spills over the entire pile, staining what might have been valid notes with the same carnival paint. It is one thing to suspect a showman. It's another to know where his show ends and the data begins. Hoaxes don't need a mastermind to do their work. They spread because they are easy to share. They trigger that quick jolt that keeps fingers tapping. For people who want the whole topic to feel silly, that ocean of noisy images does the job for free. Point to a fake next to a claim and walk away. No need to read the affidavit. No reason to follow a source back to the town where it started. The Cardiff tent collapsed a long time ago, but its ropes still trip our feet. Think about how a single loud story can drown a quiet list of numbers. 100 measured entries whisper from county ledgers. 2,000 reposted fakes shout over them. Something real can sit next to something shameless, and the shameless wins the microphone. That doesn't mean the real thing vanishes, it means it loses the room. After a couple of rounds of that, reasonable people tune out, not because they hate the truth, because it takes work to find. You see it in forums where moderators shut down threads with the word giant in the title. They're tired. So are readers who clicked one too many hoaxes. The topic turns radioactive, the way a beach closes after one bad storm of jellyfish. Folks stay away for a while even when the water clears. A graduate student who might test an old bone doesn't want the search history. A curator who might open a crate decides not to. The carnival outside drowns the quiet inside. There's a second effect, colder than the first. Once the category is marked contested, it becomes easier to file away new finds under likely false without further work. Sometimes that makes sense. The internet rewards speed, not caution. But watch what happens to a careful claim. It takes 3 paragraphs to explain why a femur's density matters, and 10 seconds for someone to paste a meme of a backhoe lifting a cartoon skull. You can almost hear the window shut. Some whisper that a few folks welcome this chaos. Not because it proves anything false, but because it blurs the line so thoroughly that serious inquiry loses its footing. You don't have to hide a bone if no one wants to touch the subject. You don't have to burn a file if the word itself makes people roll their eyes. No meetings needed, no plot, just a steady drip of fakes until the idea feels like a clown nose at a funeral. Meanwhile, the paper trail from the older world sits where it always sat. Measurements, names, dates. A letter from a county doctor to a museum office. A receipt for a crate signed in a hurry. Ink smudged at the corner. Nothing flashy. These were built for a slow system. Peer letters, meeting notes, top-of-the-fold headlines that took days to set. That system carried weight in its time. Today, speed outruns it. The digital image arrives at dawn and is gone by lunch, so we adapt. We give less attention to anything that asks for more. Consider how our heads form shortcuts. The brain loves patterns that save energy. If 9 of 10 viral giants are fake, the 10th meets that same fate before you even read the caption. We call that skepticism. It can also be laziness dressed as wisdom. The Cardiff lesson was supposed to teach care. Sometimes it teaches reflex. The reflex works until it hides more than it protects. It's one thing to dismiss a rumour, it's another to explain why it endures. These stories stick for a reason. Not just because people crave marvels, but because a few early accounts carry the odour of the real, not glossy, not neat. Mud on the page, smudges in the margin. When you meet those, the mind pauses. It might only be a breath, but it's there. Contrast that with a polished hoax that asks nothing and gives everything: size, drama, a tidy scene. Real digs are not tidy. They stink of turned soil. Bones chip at the edges. Teeth fall loose from their sockets. If an image is too clean, it sings false. The problem is that false song plays louder in crowded rooms. It's catchy. You hum it without knowing. Some try to build better filters, reverse image searches, metadata checks. They help a little, but filters tire people out too. The more work it takes to care, the fewer people choose to. That's why noise works, even if no one designed it to. It eats attention for breakfast. It leaves the careful hungry at sundown. Others counter with open archives and community notes, small ways to lower the barrier. That can work when curiosity still has breath. But curiosity is a fragile thing. It needs a steady field, not a carnival. A single good effort can't hold off a tide of copy and paste miracles for long. The tide will go out again. The question is what remains on the sand. If you follow the Cardiff thread to now, the line is easy to see. A carved giant taught a town to doubt. Our feeds scaled the lesson to the planet. The result is a topic that burns your fingers if you pick it up. Even careful work starts to smell like hype just by association. That is how camouflage happens. Not by draping a net over truth, but by filling the horizon with decoys until your eyes blur. When truth and lies burn together, the light looks the same for a moment. Then the glow fades, and you're left with soot. Under that soot, some older stories wait the way seeds wait through winter. They were never viral. They were carried by memory, by people who told the same tale around fires and kitchen tables because it matched what their elders said it matched. Those tales don't rush. They don't care about clicks. They sit in the dark and hold their shape. Which leaves us with a quiet test. If you stripped out every glossy fake and every tent show, what remains on the table? Measurements in old ink, the smell of dust in old ledgers, a few photographs that look almost bored with themselves. Not enough for certainty, perhaps. Enough to keep a hand on the thread. And as the noise rolls on, That thread leads us back to voices that never needed a spotlight to be heard. The room breathes like old paper. You move between stacks that lean a little with their own weight, leather spines soft with age, dust afloat in the candle glow. Wax runs in slow curtains down brass holders, and the heat near the flames gives way to a cool draught higher up where the domed ceiling traps the night. A clerk with ink-stained fingers turns a page with care, and the crinkle of vellum sounds louder than it should. On a wooden table lies a Bible so worn the corners have rounded. The lines in Genesis read plain and spare, treating extraordinary claims with the calm voice used for seed counts and family lines. In this light, the words feel less like sermon and more like a ledger that never expected to argue with anyone. Slide along the shelf and the room changes tone. A thinner volume opens on numbers where a scouting party returns pale and shaken, and the margin notes from some long-gone minister frame the passage with steady handwriting. He underlined a single word and added a small mark as if to say, "This part matters." The lamp sputters. A moth ticks against the glass and drops to the wood. The clerk rubs his eyes and looks again, not at the moral, but at the measurements tucked inside the story like nails in a beam. Let the frame widen. Beyond those lines, the old hall stores other voices. A rolled map of Canaan shows hill names cramped by limited ink, and somewhere between them sits the memory of the Anakim. Later on, another shelf. A thinner book recounts a duel in a valley where a champion wore bronze so heavy it reads like a wait list from an armory. You can almost hear armour settle when he moves, the thick shaft of a spear described in terms a weaver might use rather than a soldier. Some whisper that these descriptions were practical notes for listeners who knew the difference between legend and inventory. Others dismiss that as romantic reading. Either way, the detail clings to the page. Cross the aisle to a clay tablet behind glass. It bears wedge marks pressed when mud was still wet. The marks are precise, tidy, more accounting than art. The card says the script comes from a riverside city where scribes kept close track of grain, gods, and their offspring. Supporters suggest these tablets gesture toward beings whose heirs, in some tellings, were immense and temperamental, half divine and quick to dominate. Critics counter that poetry loves big bodies because scale does work on the mind. Yet the ledger-like tone mirrors the calm voice of that first book on the table, and the echo's hard to ignore. Far from the tablets, these Sanskrit shelves glow a warmer gold. The paper is thinner, the ink more fluid, and the margins carry little flower marks added by a patient hand. A priest once pinned a note about an age when humans were said to be far taller, their lifespans stretched, their duties measured by cycles we can hardly keep straight. In that scale, a 32-foot figure does not appear as a circus claim, but as a unit of a larger world, like inches to feet. If the ideas sound impossibly grand, the script's steady cadence mutes the strangeness. The text does not shout, it records. A narrow cabinet holds a copy of Enoch, a book that drifts at the edges of canon yet refuses to sink. Its pages move between the mundane and the transgressive with the same steady breath. There is a pattern of visitors and vows, of transgression and consequence, and then the note that what comes from those unions grew beyond measure, large enough to eat the fields bare. The account feels less like a dream and more like a farm record written by someone angry at ruined rows. You can almost smell crushed stalks in the heat and hear the rasp of a scythe hitting nothing but dry earth. Across the reading room, a northern shelf runs cold to the touch. The vellum there carries sharp strokes, letters like blades. The giants of that weather are older than kings and nearly as stubborn as winter itself. They fight, they bargain, they marry into lines that lead to ordinary men who still carry the echo of broader shoulders. Their world starts in collision and keeps returning to it, as if the universe itself remembers a bracing shove. In those tales, scale becomes a matter of law, as fixed as ice in the fjords until the thaw. On a lower level, tucked away from grand myths, sits a set of spiral-bound transcriptions of tribal histories taken down by local hands. The paper is cheap, the type uneven, the voices clear. A Paiute matriarch describes a time when red hair showed in firelight as enemies were driven into stone shelter and the opening was sealed with brush. She notes fear and hunger in plain words, then returns to a detail about sandals that sounds like a practical aside. The Choctaw speaker on the next page lists encounters with tall marauders like a record of raids, the habit of meeting them with force presented without flourish. That same binder includes a Comanche chief's account of an earlier race tall enough to unsettle riders at distance, and the story ends not with a curse, but with a moral about pride and loss. In the Delaware pages, a name for a people lingers in broken lines. Flood and fire arrive as if a ledger had turned to weather reports. The smell of the room deepens where sea air once touched paper. A Peruvian chronicle rests beside a sailor's knife used as a bookmark. There, a coastal community tells of boats woven from reeds and men stepping onto the sand taller than any neighbour. A scribe notes the way their hair lay heavy to the shoulders and how their eyes caught light in the evening. The description is practical, not theatrical, as if a village leader asked for a list of details in case outsiders returned. You can hear chisel and reed pen agree on one thing. Sighs travelled with rumour, but the body left its own facts in the sand. Small oddities hide in cross-references. A medieval monk copied his page with care and added a face in the margin chewing a leaf. A scholar 2 centuries later drew a measuring stick next to a spear description to check proportions. A Victorian collector taped a clipping onto a manuscript flyleaf about a bone find in a field, then wrote a single question mark. None of these notes prove anything. They carry the weight of human hands trying to anchor talk to measurement, story to scale. Some whisper that these threads were once part of a wider web, a memory that stretched across rivers and decades and only later frayed under new rules about what counts. Others dismiss that as the usual wish to find order in scattered tales. Yet the way these stories handle height, how they state it calmly, how they wrap it in itemised gear, farm losses, weights and measures, feels unlike the tone used for dragons and miracles. Dragons get poetry. Giants in these rooms get inventory. The human element repeats. A scribe's cramped fingers, a field hand counting bushels lost, a warrior lifting a shield that bites into his forearm, a grandmother teaching children the part of the song where the dangerous ones are trapped and the door is sealed. The care in those acts is the same care you see now in the clerk who reaches for a cotton glove before turning another page. The body remembers. It leaves marks on shelves and in stories. Move closer to the idea that folklore and archaeology once touched. When excavations turned up longer sandals in a Nevada cavern, some listeners said the old cave story suddenly felt less like a sermon and more like a witness statement. When a burial mound gave up thicker skulls in Midwest clay, county papers wrote plainly in the style of the Bible's lists. 1 skull, measured, 1 femur, measured, 1 report, filed. Supporters suggest that oral memory carried technical details the way a family recipe carries exact amounts without ever seeing a scale. Critics counter that practical language does not grant truth to claims, only tone to telling. Both points hold their own gravity. If you step back a pace, the pattern tilts in the lamplight and its meaning sharpens. The global tales do not match in timelines or causes. They do, however, share a habit. They record the tool with the tools of a bookkeeper. They also record the end. Floods, fires, sieges, winters that clean the slate. In that sense, the end of bodies in public rooms follows the same rhythm as the old stories. First, an age of scale, then a closing door. The clerk closes the Bible softly and covers it with cloth. The moth lies still by the lamp. The room goes cooler as the candles drop toward their stubs. Somewhere past these walls, crates sit under concrete with labels that don't match their contents. That's the rumour anyway. Inside the library, the pages can be found. Outside it, displays grow shy. If bones were carried out of sight, words were not. They learned to live in margins and song, in tablets and psalms, in the quiet memory of grandmothers, in the habit of listing what was heavy and what was lost. That calm is its own clue. Legends that want to dazzle rarely include measurements, yet these do, and they do it over and over in regions that never shared a road. Perhaps that's how testimony sounds after centuries of retelling, pared down to the details that travelled best. Perhaps it is only how human minds anchor fear to numbers. Both may be true at once. The candle gutters one last time, and the vellum cools under your hand, but the thought does not cool with it. If museum rooms forgot, the stacks did not. Somewhere, someone kept a copy and a note, a translation with a map, a family song with a warning. And if the day comes when a new crate opens and something too large for a case sees the light again, these pages will be waiting like witnesses who never move from their seats. Cold air presses against your cheeks like a held breath. The world is between seasons, the sky a hard slate, and the wind carries a dry hiss over empty ground. You stand where a river once ran wide. Now it's a braided thread cutting through gravel, ringed with ice that forms and breaks. The year is not a number you know, it's a threshold. A sudden freeze has swept the globe, a veer in climate so sharp it feels like a snapped branch. People cluster near driftwood fires, eyes stinging from smoke, watching the horizon for food that no longer comes on schedule. Shorelines aren't where they used to be. Imagine walking a familiar beach and finding it a mile inland. Tide lines etched high above your head on a cliff that used to be sand. Some describe oceans withdrawing and then returning in slow violence, swallowing settlements step by step until harbours turned into graves. A 400-foot rise sounds like a statistic. It looks like towns erased as if chalk under rain. It smells like salt in wells that were once sweet. It tastes like smoke, because forests burn when the sky changes too fast. When the weather calms, it isn't the same weather. Hunters track fewer herds. The great beasts thin out and then vanish. Mastodons, longhorned bison, the thunder of ground sloths knocking brush aside, gone within a human memory. Some whisper an impact from the sky kicked off the freeze, scattering fire and ash, then a deep chill. Others dismiss it and point to shifting currents and delicate feedbacks inside the climate's gears. The certainty shifts like ice on a river. What stands firm is the interruption. A cold knife cut through the old order and left edges still visible in the earth. On a rise in southeastern Turkey, stone stands where fields once waved. The pillars at Göbekli Tepe lift out of the dust like flat-shouldered sentinels, T-forms sunk into ringed enclosures. They are older than the stories people usually tell about cities and farms. They predate pottery, they predate the wheel. The carvings are crisp. Fox, crane, lion, serpent. The weight of some pillars approaches 50 tons. No metal tools, no draft animals, no mapped grid. Just organised hands, ropes, ramps and a plan measured in patience. Whoever built this hill of circles understood order. They set stone in patterns that mirror a logic we still trace with survey lines and night skies. Karahan Tepe rises from the same region like a sibling with parallels and its own voice. Together, these places suggest a culture with structure and skilled labour long before fields were furrowed in a steady way. You can see chisel marks and the ghost of work schedules in how clean the lines are. If you kneel and place your palm on a pillar, the limestone feels cool and a little moist in the morning shade. The touch narrows time. The builders vanished. No graveyards stacked with their remains, no tidy chain of classrooms and workshops leading up from caves. The record falls silent where you expect footsteps. Put the climate swing beside those stones, and a shape emerges. Supporters suggest this was a lighthouse for a people who had watched the world drown its edges. A memory of better tools and lost methods carried inland, then carved into durable language. Critics counter that hunter-gatherers can coordinate large projects when ritual binds labour, and that's true. Yet every careful measurement here adds weight to a question. Why this scale, here, this early, with this precision? The pattern tilts in the light, and its meaning sharpens. Now widen the scene. The animals of that last glacial breath were large, robust, built for a climate that favoured mass. The oxygen balance and pressure were not the same as now. Some whisper that heavy bodies made sense in that air, that stronger bones and wider chests fit the work of the time, stalking elephantine prey, hauling carcasses, moving stone. If a human lineage tended towards size in that world, you'd expect dense femurs, thick cranial vaults, and leverage that reads like built-in scaffolding. You would not expect the fragile geometry of pituitary excess. You'd expect scaled anatomy, not stretched. Walk through that world in your mind's slow camera. You move past a stand of birch, see prints in mud the size of serving platters. There's a smell of damp hide. A staff leans against a rock, and you notice the handholds are spaced too far apart for your grip. A woven sandal print measures longer than your forearm. These are small human hints that a different standard unit once walked here, a body designed for heavy loads and long range. Then the water rises. It rises without hurry in the daily sense and with great speed in the historical sense. Coastlines migrate, harbours flood, shore temples sink by degrees. Far out in the Pacific, a city of basalt sits on a web of tidal channels. Nan Madol, a lattice of massive prismatic columns. The engineering is hard to reconcile with canoe-scale transport, though people did clever things with rafts and levers. The blocks lock like organ pipes and form walls that shrug off waves. The site is not underwater, but it reads like a survivor of another shoreline logic. Under the sea near Japan, terraces step down in Yonaguni, sharp where they should be soft if only currents shape them. There are right angles, flat faces, ramps that look intentional. Some geologists see natural fracture and erosion. Others see the hand of people cutting and squaring. In the Bahamas, long lines of stone called Bimini Road lie in clear water, blocks that seem laid in neat courses. Critics counter their beach rock fractured along regular seams. Supporters suggest a harbour foundation for vessels that needed depth and calm water when the sea stood lower. What ties these locations is not certainty, but timing. The last melt put shorelines on the move, and anything built too close to the line fell into blue. At each of these places, divers describe the sensation of swimming over a city's skeleton. There's a hush under the water broken by your own breath, and the mind fills gaps the eye cannot resolve. Yet even on land, there are puzzles of scale. Walls that expect a taller stride. Door sills that ask for a longer leg to clear. Lintels high enough that you feel small in a way beyond awe. The world after the flood might have remembered the world before it the way a child remembers a dream, in fragments with strong feelings attached. Link that thought to the American interior. If a memory of method survived a hard winter of the planet, then the people who carried it would apply it where they could, with the materials they had. Earth instead of dressed stone. Timber instead of basalt columns. Circles and alignments maintained with sight lines and repeated observation. Burial mounds, geometric earthworks, and horizon markers that track celestial cycles with patience rather than machines. You stand on a ridge and watch the moon pause at far extremes and return. 18.5 years take discipline to see. That's a long breath to hold. Yet some complexes hold it. The idea that knowledge travelled across water before recorded dates is not a new one. The ice-forced migrations along coasts that later drowned. If a network existed, thin, irregular, but real, it would have moved myths, star lore and building tricks. It might also have moved bloodlines. A tall, strong subset could disperse along routes that later submerged. When the ocean rose, it erased their docks but not their habits. Those habits show up inland, on hills and in plains, as structures that seem to inherit a method rather than invent it from scratch. Take that back to Göbekli Tepe. Those T-pillars feel like a prototype and a memorial. They gather people and fix story in stone, but they also teach. The enclosures are classrooms without chalk. The geometry encodes a system for organising labour and revisiting the place with a shared memory. If the builders were survivors of a coast that no longer existed, this is how you restart. You root your calendar and your community on high ground. You bury the complex when you're done, as if to close a book without burning it. The human cost sits just off stage. Someone watched the sea take their village. Someone kept a carved idol of a fish god and handed it to a child on a road inland. Someone with shoulders as wide as a doorframe carried 2 loads at once and told stories under a low sky about cities along a shining edge now under waves. The child grew up inland and learned to align poles with sunsets that mattered. This is how memory persists when shelves are empty. The skeptics have their case, and it is not thin. Natural processes make odd angles. People can haul impressive weights with clever rigs. Ritual can motivate work on a grand scale without needing cities. Yet the cluster of anomalies, timelines that tilt early, sites that drown, stones that overperform the expected, invites a different kind of listening. Supporters suggest the flood tales around the world are not coincidence but chorus. The verses change, the refrain holds. If that chorus holds a truth about people who are larger on average than we are, then certain excavations in the American record take on another tone. Reports of dense bones and unusual dentition stop sounding like isolated curios and start resembling echoes from a climate where size worked. The post-glacial world could have trimmed that body plan back by simple selection pressure. Smaller bodies eat less. They need fewer calories in thin times. Over generations, the tall blood dilutes, but not everywhere and not all at once. This frame pulls mounds and monuments into a wider map. If knowledge moved when oceans were highways and memory condensed into durable forms on uplands, then earthworks in North America could be the descendants of a drowned syllabus. Builders didn't experiment blindly, they remembered and adapted. The great rings and long embankments do not shout, but they hold their lines against centuries of rain. That kind of patience reads like inheritance. The result is a quiet but relentless suggestion. The American bones that keep disappearing from view are not anomalies stumbling into history. They might be the last pages of a chapter, written before the water rose, carried inland by survivors who knew how to set stone to thought. It places a different weight on old newspaper measurements and museum tags that lead nowhere. It makes absence feel less like failure and more like erasure. Let the frame widen one more notch. If the pre-flood world seeded its math and muscle along retreating coasts, then the people who inherited it would leave marks you can see from the sky. Long animals etched into earth, mounds aligned to patient moons, networks that only make sense when you climb high or drift above in a balloon. And if those inheritors stood taller than we expect, with bone built for load and reach, then the monuments ahead may read less like wonders and more like tools scaled to a different hand. Moonlight lies soft across Ohio fields, and the air holds that damp mineral smell you get after a late summer rain. You stand at the edge of Serpent Mound where the ground rises and coils in a long measured curve. Crickets carry the hour. The cool dampness lifts through grass blades that brush your ankles, and the earth itself feels shaped by hands that knew the sky. The serpent's head opens toward the western horizon, where the last orange line of day would sit at the solstice. You cannot see the alignment with your feet on the ground. You feel it instead, the way the neck kinks like a dial, the way the mouth frames a low notch where the sun sets once a year with a precision that shouldn't belong to people moving soil with baskets and hope. A ranger with a thermos and a quiet voice points out the curve's subtle highs and lows. He runs a small flashlight along a ridge, stops at a shallow mound where soil changes tone, then clicks the beam off to let your eyes adjust to starlight. He says the measure is in the land itself. No drama, just quiet certainty. A breath of wind moves. The grass leans and lifts. Somewhere a fox yips and then falls quiet. The serpent waits through the dark like a patient instrument. Let the frame widen. Across the Miami Valley, the Miamisburg Mound rises above a patchwork of streetlights and barn roofs, 65 feet of layered earth climbing into night. You can walk the steps to a platform near the top. The climb puts heat in your legs and a slow pull in your breath. Down below, the circumference runs like a low horizon line, a ring that would take time to trace with your fingers. Accounts say roughly 54,000 cubic yards of soil were moved by hand. That's baskets lifted and dumped, day after day, with a steady rhythm of labour that leaves no signature but height. Supporters suggest an obvious thought that isn't comfortable. Add longer stride, broader shoulders, more leverage, and the math of impossible projects bends towards simple. There's a chill at the top. Your palm rests on a wooden rail that feels damp with dew. The mind wants a plan. Who counted loads? Who kept time? Who watched the sky? The mound answers with its usual quiet. It stands, and by standing it tells you someone could. Let your map stretch wider. East of the Mississippi, LiDAR, the airplane lasers that strip away trees, has started to draw ghostly lines under corn and oak. Curves emerge where fields once looked flat. Channels, circles, and earth walls appear like footprints at low tide. The new shapes hint at a system rather than scatter, geometry that strings sites together like beads. It's not noise, it repeats. Modern surveyors trace arcs and right angles, and the draw of it is simple. The ground holds a memory we forgot to read. Farther south, Cahokia sits under a modern skyline, a city that rose 1,000 years ago with mounds and plazas and wood posts that mark the seasons. The main platform covers a base wide enough to dominate a human map. In your head you try to weigh it. You taste dust and sun off open soil. People lived, traded, married, argued, and offered thanks in the shadow of that platform. Greys from the region sometimes hold bones with heft that catches in the hands of excavators. Some whisper that density readings run higher than expected for age and condition. Critics counter that preservation conditions play tricks. The debate doesn't reach your ears here. What you feel is the weight of intent. Newark's earthworks unfold as if someone sketched a machine for watching the sky, and then walked it full scale into the ground. An octagon links to a great circle by a wide corridor of levelled earth. The alignments track the moon's long cycle, a nearly 2-decade swing that asks for patience and records. 18.5 years is a long promise to keep if your tools are sightlines and memory. You walk where walls once stood high. In the grass you lose the pattern. From the air it snaps into place, a blueprint that makes itself known only to a view you don't have at ground level. Standing in the cut of the path you feel small. Not unimportant, just small in a system scaled to the sky. Louisiana's poverty point lays down ring after ring, huge arcs of earth that curl around a central space. The soil is dark and damp, it clings to boots and holds moisture. Those concentric ridges are set with accuracy that would cost a modern crew time and instruments. The site's age pushes back past common timelines, far older than many expect for planning at this scale. No stone blocks shine here. It's dirt and contour in a sweeping sense that someone loved arcs. The old embankments become a quiet calculus of sight, angle, and repetition. Here's where the breath catches. If builders shaped landscapes with attention to lunar standstills and solstice sunsets, what did they stand on to check the line? A staff? A tower? Or bodies tall enough to raise a horizon by inches, enough to change a sight line? Others dismiss that idea as romance dressed in numbers, but the question arrives on its own schedule and won't leave. Newark's octagon lines to where the moon rises at its furthest edge of motion. The precision is not a rumour, it's ground to pace off. Whether achieved by instrument or vantage, the effect is the same. Someone tracked a subtle cycle that most of us never notice. Back at Serpent Mound, a child's hand fits into a shallow notch in the effigy's side. The notch is part of the serpent's body, a minor detail in lengths of curve. The child asks if this is where you put the key. The parent smiles and says, "Maybe." The field returns to its low chorus. You watch how the serpent's curves are not wandering. They break and roll with intent. The head's oval opens toward the place where the sun finishes its longest walk. It has the feel of a calendar you enter with your feet. Night thickens and draws out the scent of damp soil. You step toward a marker where an old excavation once cut into the mound side. The grass grows smoother there. History did its work and then pasted the wound with seed. Some claim the soil layers inside these structures follow staging as if measured by a team who knew how to build up depth and hold a shape. Critics counter that any patient group could learn the same by trial and habit. Both thoughts can be true. The structures remain either way. The question about bodies returns like a low tone behind a song. If labour scaled up by limb and reach, would you see it in the residues? Carry marks on logs notched higher than standard human shoulder height. Leverage points on sleds spaced wider. Post holes placed not for ladders, but for hands reaching from a taller chest. It may sound fanciful, yet wood posts rot and sleds become soil. What remains is the ground's geometry and our willingness to notice. Consider a work crew at Miamisburg in a world with no metal trucks, just fibre ropes and hooped baskets. A foreman, if that's even the right word, touches a stick to mark a slope. Bodies move in rhythm. Stride length changes how many steps it takes to crest, how easily weight shifts, how a basket rises from shoulder to lip. The human part of it aches with predictability. Backs sore at dusk, water passed in dipper cups, a joke called out to lighten a groove. Nothing supernatural lives in that picture, nothing shouty, just a hum of labour that had to end in a form. Cahokia lingers because it pushes scale without myth. The plaza spreads, postmark sightlines, and the platform sits like a table waiting for ceremony. A volunteer dusts a replica pot in a small museum nearby. The sound of the cloth drag is soft. She says the site hosted feasts and fasts, a cycle of plenty and restraint. Her hand pauses over a shard. It's an ordinary motion. It pulls the past into the room in a way that no sweeping theory can. With Newark and Poverty Point on the mind, the astronomical rhythm loops back. The lunar standstill cycle of 18.6 years is not intuitive if you only watch full moons wax and wane. It needs a ledger and a lookout. It rewards patience. Some whisper that a taller line of sight, a head lifted feet above the next person's, might ease long-range checks across embankments. It's a small advantage scaled over years. Or maybe there were tripod frames and sighting boards and strings pulled taut. The tools vanish, yet the alignments survive. The mystery refuses a single answer out of courtesy, as if it likes being asked. From another angle, the architecture and the anatomy begin to rhyme. If communities had a fraction of members built large, tasked for heavy move days and set pole hours, then what looks like miracle shift to logistics. No pulleys required, no cranes beyond bone and tendon. Some will call that a story people tell when they want wonder without wires. Others will ask why wonder needs to borrow anything at all when the ground already keeps time with the sky. You crouch at the serpent's tail where the curves tighten, and you run 2 fingers along the edge where grass thins. The soil is cooler here. The night breeze carries water odour from a nearby creek. It's not dramatic, it's steady. The mound lays out a long thought in dirt, and the thought aims you at the horizon where the year's longest day goes down. If that aim holds because a careful eye checked it, the builders were astronomers. If it holds because a long-armed watcher could read the land from a higher perch, the builders were astronomers too. Either way, the sky got red. In the end, the monuments sit beyond reach of cramped storerooms. You cannot box a quarter-mile of effigy. You cannot hide a 65-foot cone unless you grow trees and build neighbourhoods and teach people not to look up. The earth keeps their shapes like a quiet oath. The serpent's curve, the octagon's stubborn angles, the rings that refuse to fade from Louisiana mud. Bones could vanish into crates, but these lines anchor to the land and call out to any eye willing to follow. The pattern tilts in the light and its meaning sharpens. The question shifts from whether giants walked here to whether they raised what still stands. And if these alignments hint at shared knowledge, angles and cycles that moved across bays and inlets long before recent maps, then the trail may not stop at the edge of this continent at all. Dawn thickens over open water. You're in a narrow canoe, the kind lashed with cord and patience, palm fibre rope biting your fingers. Wind carries the damp sweetness of a root you know by heart, Kumara. The tuba sits snug in a woven basket between your feet. Your captain mouths the word the same way your grandparents did, with the same round vowels. On the far side of the world, farmers in Andean air say a twin word, Kumara, while their soil births the plant wild. 2 shores, 1 name, 1 crop that crossed blue distances most maps once treated like walls. You watch the helmsman lift his chin to the sky. No sextant clicks, no brass, just a star compass mapped in the mind, where rising points and swell angles fix a lane as sure as any painted road. The canoe thuds against a long swell. The ribs creak. You taste salt and smoke from last night's cook fire. By noon, the water turns the colour of a green bottle, and a petrel skims your bow, a narrow wing pointing home like a signpost. Someone hums to keep time with the paddle strokes. A word passes down the boat. A land wind. It smells of clay dust and flowers you don't have names for. Now let the frame widen. A few hundred years later, a pit opens in Chilean soil. A trench wall crumbles, and a field worker brushes away grit until bone comes clean. A chicken's leg, then more. The lab breathes cool, chemical air. Dates return that lean back into centuries before Columbus, and the DNA holds a thread that runs to Polynesia. Not a rumour, a result. Far from the canoe, an echo hangs in a white room and redraws a line on a map with a steady hand that does not ask permission. Another lab lights up a different puzzle. Linen-wrapped bodies lie in museum air that smells like old paper. Tests flicker on screens. In the mix, coca and tobacco compounds. Those plants grew first under American skies. Others dismiss it as contamination. Museum cabinets, handling, the 1,000 ways a story might smear in the chain of custody. Supporters suggest the chemistry hints at exchange reaching further than we like to think. The truth perhaps rests somewhere between the instrument's precision and the long, messy life of artifacts that pass through too many hands. You ride a swell line forward again. The sea is quiet under the keel, more felt than heard, a soft slide of the world moving. A navigator stands at night, feet wide, and stitches a route from stars and swells. The star compass is not a device, it's a memory cathedral. Clouds cover the sky, so he drops a shell in the hull. Its rattle on wood tells him the wind's angle when sight fails. There's no modern clock to hold longitude, yet men carry a map in their ribs. A shark comes up on the port side, and the helmsman smiles. Its path marks a ridge that leads toward land. The shark is a chart if you know how to read a fin. In a royal workshop centuries later, a cartographer inks coastlines on skin-thin parchment. A map signed by Piri Reis bears outlines that lean beyond what European pilots record at the time. Some whisper it sketches a cold southern coast beneath ice. Others draw a line through that claim with a blue pencil, calling it misread shoreline, copied rumour, a pastiche of older charts with no miracle required. The page does not explain itself. On another shore, sagas tell of Vinland, and timber beams in Newfoundland prove that men wearing wool and iron made landfall long before a Genoan sailor asked for royal flags. Across the Pacific, a fleet swells like a moving city. Junghi's hulls climb the horizon, varnish gleaming, deck planks hot under the noon sun. The ships carry porcelain, silk, spices, and the discipline of a court that turns the world into lists. The helms have compass bowls floating in oil. Engines of muscle and sail drive them to ports that feed their story back into steelies and court gossip. Did they touch the Americas? The record falls quiet where rumour grows loud. Critics counter that no hard proof shores up the most sweeping claims, but the sheer fact of the fleet's reach makes the ocean feel smaller, even if its ultimate edges remain in haze. Stand on a South Pacific beach. A child pulls a root from sand-darkened sackcloth, laughs, and says Kumara with the same vowels your helmsman used. A stone terrace rises behind her, at a pitch set for sun and rain. A technology that moves water downhill in steps like careful music. Across the water in the Andes, cocos rustle like small flags in wind. Words match. Crops match. A faint trail of genetics threads a chicken bone to an island. Much of this sits on firmer ground than myth, and some of it lives in the soft range where artifact, error and wonder blend at the edges. The old idea that oceans forbid contact feels thinner when you hold a canoe in mind that can cross 2,000 miles without a tool more complex than a coconut fibre rope, a stick chart, and a brain trained to see the world's hidden lines. A dead reckoning that isn't dead at all, a living reckoning tuned to the night's texture. Star houses that rise at predicted points, swell trains that sing along the hull, reading foam and bird flight the way a scribe reads ink. There is nothing primitive in that. It's an alternative instrument set played on an older stage. If crops can leap oceans and languages mirror each other in a root's name, then bodies could have crossed too. Here the water grows deeper. Supporters suggest that with goods came people, families, sailors, maybe scouts who married into local lines and left children whose height or bone thickness raised eyebrows in later centuries. Not a single migration, but threads braided into a rope you only see when light hits it right. Others dismiss such talk as the mind's wish to find lines where there are only dots. The canoe holds steady between those positions, its bow pointed at evidence that asks simple questions and refuses simple answers. Widen the lens to the North Atlantic. Hard timber halls record tales of a man who could lift what 6 men struggled to move. That's drama as much as biography. But then a blackened iron rivet shifts in a Newfoundland trench, and you feel the weight of proof in your palm. At the same time, names like Bjarni and Leif step out of legend's mist and into the dry breath of field notes. They didn't conquer a continent. They camped, cut lumber, and left. The echo matters just the same. Now think of the American finds we've walked past in this series. Bones recorded at sizes that strain the mind, then sealed into crates and shipped east. Alone, each case looks like an oddity that a busy curator might misplace. Together they form a rhythm. If knowledge moves in webs and not straight lines, then the tallest people recorded in American soil might fit into a larger network that ran along ocean paths, not just river valleys. That does not claim fleets of giants. It suggests bloodlines and skills travel the same lanes as seeds and stories. The canoe nudges a foreign shore in your mind. The first step on sand leaves a deep print, not monstrous, just longer, wider, weighty. You follow the print to a terraced field, where the earth feels springy beneath your heel. Far inland, a mound rises in quiet curves that answer the sun. None of this proves giants at sea. It hints at an older habit. Distant peoples closing distance, sharing food and words, which opens a channel where unusual bodies could move too. The pattern tilts in the light, and its meaning sharpens enough to tempt, not to settle. In a library hall, a curator turns a map page and pauses on coastlines that look too confident too early. He pencils a question mark in the margin and closes the book with a dry thud. Questions breed in the dim. What else crossed water that we don't track? Bones, perhaps, wrapped in sailcloth and traded as curios, or carried alive as labour and kin. Some whisper that the tallest among them served as shipboard anchors of a different sort. Strength embodied where rope and wood met sea and storm. It's a human wish to give every skill a body. It's also a reminder that technology includes hands. The isolationist story offers comfort. Civilizations rise in neat boxes. They touch only at edges we can number. The diffusionist counter-story is messier. It has rafts on kelp highways, chickens scratching in Andean yards before the first Iberian flag appears, sweet potatoes growing in soils that never knew an American plough. As soon as that mess becomes policy, it demands edits in textbooks, museum labels, and national myths. Not all edits are lies. Some are choices about what to emphasise, yet choices accumulate. When choices gather in one place, in a national museum, say, a crop that proves a voyage might sit in the case, while a bone that strains a category lands in a drawer. Critics counter that curators follow evidence and space, not whispers and fear. Supporters suggest the boundary between tidy story and full story is thinner than the public gallery makes it seem. You can stand on either side of that glass and see your own reflection outshine the artifact. Out on the water, your helmsman lifts a hand. The boat tilts toward a current line, that slick seam where two waters meet. It feels like a choice with consequences. A cloud bank slides off the moon. The wake glows with tiny sparks, plankton firing under the oars. The old sea roads are still there, drawn in light no museum owns. The kumara in your basket bumps your ankle, as if to remind you that proof sometimes looks like dinner. If that humble route carried a name and a gene across an ocean, then the path existed. If the path existed, someone walked it. If people walked it, even a few, then blood mingled, tools moved, and the odd child grew taller than his neighbours. You don't need a fleet of titans to alter a story. You need a few crossings taken seriously. That's the kind of fact that doesn't shout. It just sits, patient as a star that rises where it should, night after night. So the question grows teeth. If pre-Columbian contact laced the world together more than we've allowed, and if some of those threads pulled unusual bodies into new lands, why does the official record prefer clean edges? It may be simple caution, it may be inertia. Or, some whisper, it may be the same preference for a manageable past that sends awkward bones into storage. The canoe slides on, hull whispering against the swell as the shoreline ahead stays dark. And somewhere beyond that black strip of land, a locked door waits to see what you'll do when you knock. The room smells like coal smoke and ink. You stand in the back of a committee chamber as men in dark coats lean over maps tacked to a long table. Thin blue pencil lines cut through the planes. Surveyors' stakes sit like little bones in a box. Outside the windows, wagon wheels rattle on wet cobblestone, and a paperboy shouts about new ruins found in the Ohio Valley. Headlines promise progress, but the type below them talks about earthen monuments and unfamiliar astronomy. The air runs warm, crowded and tense, as if the map itself is arguing with the men who plan to fold it. At the far end, a land commissioner taps ash into a tray and moves a county boundary. Another man lifts a document with language about removal, title and improvement. Through the glass, you glimpse a broadsheet pinned to a kiosk, a sketch of a serpent-shaped ridge, and a column beside it claiming ancient builders, not wanderers. The words don't rise, they press down. If the ground holds the work of a complex culture, the story of a blank canvas becomes harder to sell. It lands like grit in the gears. Let the frame widen a little. The calculus behind the maps is simple on paper and difficult in daylight. If earthen works align to solstice sunset, if trade bundles show copper from far north and shells from the Gulf, then the wilderness stops being a blank and starts being a library. Some whisper that the tallest skeletons, tall enough to clear brush in a stride, sat not at the edges of society, but at its heart, among planners who watch the sky and track seasons. Others dismiss this as romance layered over rumour, yet the collision remains. Conquest wants an empty stage. Archaeology keeps finding footprints in the wings. On a different street a few blocks away, lamps burn in a seminary classroom. A professor in a high collar reads from a thin Bible with notes in the margins. His students listen while a map of the Levant curls at the corners. The talk shifts from metaphor to measure. Flood accounts compared to new geological timelines. Old words wade in a late industrial night. You hear the soft scratch of a fountain pen. If Genesis moves from figurative language to field report, then bones described as giants stop being a parable and start being evidence. Supporters suggest this new closeness between scripture and spade creates pressure on both to explain more than they can. Across town, A college dean scans letters from scholars who want funds for fresh digs. The forms pile up. There's pride in holding a clean narrative, rising steps from simple to complex, no leaps, no lost branches. Careers have been built on that staircase. Critics counter that any bone that misses a stair gets kicked aside as error. In the museum down the hill, a curator rehearses a tour for donors. He practices tidy phrases and avoids tangles. Complexity costs, simplicity sells. The labels on display read like solved puzzles. The storage drawers fill with pieces that don't fit. You can hear the machinery in that choice. A professor who defends the timeline defends more than a diagram. He defends grants, peer standing, the textbook he spent 5 years writing, the promise he made to a new department hire. A publisher who revises the past must reprint 1,000 classroom sets. A board member wants a clear story to show visitors after lunch. No villain is needed for a document to be filed under pending and never leave the drawer. It's easy to hide in paperwork, no one has to shout, they just have to shrug. Out in the territories where the inked lines will land, a survey crew eats noon bread in the shade of a mound that locals say marks old burials. One man runs his palm over a shard from a copper breastplate scored with tiny punch marks. Another folds the piece in cloth because the wind grit stings. He knows a paper back east called a similar find evidence of artisanship. He also knows his pay comes from a government that writes improvement on deeds. The clash is not abstract to him, it sits heavy in his pocket. At sunset, the ridge holds the last light a fraction longer than the flats. Someone once measured that, he thinks, then rolls the map and keeps going. Back in the chamber, the moral defence of expansion rests on a phrase repeated until it sounds like math. The wilderness needs order, the land needs stewards, but the headlines outside the window report astronomers who used earth and sky as instruments, and traders who carried stories between rivers. If those reports gain weight, the needs order line falters. It doesn't collapse in a drum roll. It sags in quiet decisions. A committee delays a hearing, a desk edits a footnote, a museum guide shortens a paragraph about a burial that doesn't match the average. The drift is small and steady. Soon, no one remembers the longer version. A different set of hands flips through budgets in a printer-smelling office. Cost columns tally not just field camps and rail freight, but the burden of changing minds. A new narrative means more than swapping plaques. It means rethinking whose past is being touched, whose treaties were justified by the idea of lack rather than presence. That kind of rethink spills out of glass cases and onto courthouse steps. The people in charge of those steps prefer dry marble, not floods, incentive whispers where orders aren't needed. In a quiet hallway, a young lecturer reads a draft article that questions the neat, independent evolution of every culture. He scratches out a paragraph about exchange across vast distances and writes a softer line that keeps the frame local. He wants tenure. He wants to teach. He tells himself he'll write the bolder paper later. Later has a way of moving. Many choices like his don't build a conspiracy. They build a slope. Once the slope exists, bones with inconvenient features slide. Walk a few blocks further. A printer wipes ink from his hands and stacks broadsheets. The front page carries two pieces that pull in opposite directions. One praises civilization's march. The other catalogues an excavation where a set of jawbones could cover a grown man's face. The printer watches which column draws more attention. He has a family to feed. Advertisers like optimism. Unruly facts get shuffled to page 6. Not burned, not denied. Just moved until eyes pass over them. Near midnight, the seminary lights dim. One student lingers, tracing a verse with a fingertip and then looking at a newspaper clipping folded into his book. If the old tales hold more report than fable, he wonders, what would that demand of his sermons? He thinks about his elders, their expectations, his own belief. He isn't hiding anything. He's struggling with how wide truth might run. The tension lives in him as much as in any institution. By dawn, the city's smoke thins over the river. In the committee room, the maps are rolled. The ashtrays are cold. The men have gone home. On the windowsill, a headline curls as glue dries. More mounds surveyed, measurements noted, artifacts boxed for Washington. The logic of empire does not require lies. It thrives on the ease of a narrower story. When edges grow inconvenient, they don't get trimmed with a blade. They get folded under. The pattern tilts in the light, and its meaning sharpens. Erasure, when it happens, doesn't always come from malice. It comes from motive, from budgets that prefer tidy answers, from faiths that fear being asked to grow, from careers guarded like homesteads. The result is the same either way. What threatens the foundation gets moved out of view until no one has to explain it at committee. You return to the street. The paperboy's voice has gone hoarse. Headlines change, habits don't. If giants undercut the myth of an empty land, if complex astronomy at ancient sites unsettles claims of simple origins, then the reasons to forget multiply in quiet ways. Not a plotline, but a preference. Not a villain, but a system that picks comfort over questions, which sets the stage for the present tense. The repository is no longer just warehouses and ledgers, it's feeds and search bars. If yesterday's incentive was to file a crate out of sight, today's is to file a topic out of mind. Before the sun is high, what you see will be what passes a filter, and what doesn't fit will fall into the scroll. You stand in a glass-walled war room that smells faintly of coffee and ozone. November air presses against the windows of a Los Gatos campus, and every screen burns the same graph. A staircase of views climbs in sharp steps. Ancient Apocalypse has just gone live in dozens of countries, and a tide of comments scrolls faster than eyes can follow. It isn't the plot that has the room leaning forward, it's the feedback loop. Every like feeds reach. Every pause shortens it. You watch a producer rub a thumb across a cracked phone screen, counting mentions by the tens of thousands. The hum of servers is the only steady thing in the room. By night 2, the trendline glows like a runway. Watch time is long. Rewatches spike after midnight. Clips break off and circulate stripped of context, recaptioned in half a dozen languages. The dashboard shows heat in places boardrooms rarely expect. Jakarta, Recife, Bratislava, while a chat tool pings non-stop. This is not just viewing. It's a public audit of what counts as plausible. You can almost hear the edges of authority flex as the stream keeps pouring in. Within 72 hours, the counter-rhythm arrives. Inboxes fill with statements that read like templates. Departments post threads. Cool in tone and very sure of themselves. Editorial boards schedule quick-turn essays. A podcast panel assembles by Friday, the host promising a measured takedown, their voice just a shade too quick. It doesn't feel like casual critique. It feels like an alarm system waking up, each node blinking in sequence. Some whisper that controversy is marketing. Others dismiss that as naive. Either way, the coordination is hard to miss. The cadence settles into something familiar. First, criticize with authority. Credentials front and centre, citations dense, the framing clear. This is not about ideas worth weighing. It is about norms under threat. Next, nudge the algorithmic rails. The show remains visible, but search begins to lean. Suggestions steer toward debunks. Thumbnails grey out with gentle warning labels. Autoplay prefers a safer neighbour. Then the reputations take their turn. Quotes are pulled, context thins, and the person becomes the story. Finally, a softer lid slides into place. Content notices appear before a video even loads. A topic cluster merges, giants with flat earth and lizard myths, and the effect is blunt. Guilt by adjacency. You see it spill beyond the series. A short that mentions oversized skulls gets tagged with a health advisory. A long-form essay on diffusion, the spread of culture across oceans, loses ad eligibility, while a less careful parody sails through. A forum thread collecting old county records vanishes for low-quality information. It might be an honest filter. It might also be a net with holes tailored to what some regard as respectable. Supporters suggest this is simply risk control in a litigious world. Critics counter that the net always seems to catch the same fish. The pattern has a history. Decades ago, Thor Heyerdahl lashed a raft together and let trade winds prove a route. The experiment didn't settle the past, but it made a claim testable at sea. Later, Barry Fell traced odd inscriptions to ancient alphabets, and fell under a pile of footnotes that argued not just errors, but impropriety. He may have stretched the line, yet the response served as a message. Certain doors stay shut. You can hear the echo of those doors in the present. The tools are new, the contours are not. Modern gatekeeping is polite. It comes wrapped in safety language and user experience flow. A fact-check screen sits atop a thumbnail like a napkin on a drink. A mod note asks for peer-reviewed sources only, in a space where peer review cannot easily reach. An expert collab flags a list of debunked claims, and half the listed points never appeared in the content at hand. The misfire doesn't matter. The shape of the fence is what counts. There's a logic to the fence. Platforms run on trust. One scandal in the boardroom feels heat, advertisers call, and engineers lose sleep. Preemptive caution becomes policy. Policy becomes code. Code has no sense of proportion. It sees keywords and routes traffic away. An Ernest Field note about 19th century mounds falls into the same lane as a carnival fake with an excavator for scale. The sorter cannot tell bone from plaster. It only knows what reduces complaint volume. Meanwhile, ridicule arrives faster than research. A host raises an eyebrow, drops a quip, and 1,000 comments follow the tone. A grant committee scans a proposal and decides the topic is noisy. A junior scholar deletes a thread after a senior colleague replies with a screenshot and a sigh. No ban was needed. The social weather did the work. You feel how soft force can be. It moves without leaving fingerprints. The symmetry comes into view when you let the light change. In the late 1800s, shipping labels and rail schedules created a choke point. Unusual bones travelled to one address and often ended in rooms no public foot ever reached. In the 2020s, dashboards and ranking code create their own bottleneck. Unusual ideas travel into feeds, then get corralled by context cards and suggestion stacks that draw a neat circle around what should be seen. The method evolved. The effect stayed steady. Make the anomaly hard to find. Some of this is protection. Hoaxes are allowed. A single fake can stain a field for years. But protection turns to pruning when the blade always swings the same way. A thread posting photographs of measuring rods beside oversized femurs earns a missing context badge, while a jokey edit of the same images floats untouched. The line between curation and culling blurs at just the point where curiosity needs air. You might ask why the alarm sounds so quickly. The answer may be simple. Narratives are ballast. They steady the ship. A story that lets civilizations bloom alone on tidy timelines keeps lesson plans clean and museum maps legible. A story that suggests ancient contact, uneven memory, or bodies that break the chart complicates everything from curriculum to tourism. Complication costs money. It also exposes how little we know. Institutions are not built for that kind of wind. So the modern playbook favours gentle removal, not a bonfire of books, a dimmer switch. Slightly fewer people see the post. The search result moves down a notch. A recommendation never quite appears. A creator's next video takes 2 hours longer to index. Each notch can be explained. Together they steer the conversation away from the wrong shelf. There's a human toll inside the interface. A librarian declines to host a talk after a quick search returns only the loudest enunciations. A teacher thinks twice about a module on ancient navigation because the last time it drew the wrong kind of email. A filmmaker watches a revenue dip line up perfectly with a phrase in a title and learns, quietly, not to use it again. No memo needed. The message travels. When you put it alongside the older stories, crates, tags, catalogues that end in warehouse walls, the mirror is hard to ignore. The past saw matter moved out of sight. The present sees attention turned aside. In both cases, the audience loses contact with the thing itself, not disproven, not even argued with, just routed elsewhere. The truth, perhaps, is boring in shape and profound in impact. Most of this is not a mastermind plan. It is incentives and risk models applied by software that holds no opinions except the ones we write into it. Still, the outcome rhymes with the earlier chapters. Bones didn't need to be smashed. They needed to be boxed. Ideas don't need to be banned. They need to be framed as unserious, then moved off stage. You watch the dashboard calm as the cycle completes. The graph still climbs, but the suggested videos around it have changed. The comments lean a little colder. The conversation contracts. Somewhere in that quiet edge, a different kind of absence forms. The kind that looks like choice, but feels like a corridor narrowing by design. And if giants can vanish without a fight, what else waits in the algorithmic shade, visible to anyone who already knows the path but lost to everyone else passing by? The room is cold enough to fog your breath. Fluorescent tubes hum overhead, a pale wash falling across rows of measuring tables that never made it onto any floor plan. A stainless tray rattles as you set it down. On it rests a femur thick as a baseball bat, heavy in a way your wrist feels. Nearby, a caliper hangs from a peg like a barber's razor. The skull beside it carries a circumference that laughs at modern sizing charts, its vault dense, its jaw broad and hungry looking. 3 doors line the far wall, each unmarked, each waiting. You walk slowly, hand grazing the cool edge of a table. The first door seems to breathe. Behind it, some whisper a lineage separate from us and our usual cousins, a branch not Homo sapiens, not Neanderthal. Think of a people scaled for a world of mammoths and dire wolves, bodies tuned to long winters, deep snow and heavy loads. If bone grows with stress, their frames tell of pressure as normal life. Critics counter that no museum case holds such a skeleton. The lock turns quietly anyway. Open it. Cold air moves across paper tags. On a placard that doesn't exist, a note reads, "Built for mass, not height alone." The long bones are proportioned differently. Thickness first, length second. Crowns of teeth crowd the jaw, some in double ranks, like a mouth engineered for a diet that fought back. Supporters suggest extinction did the work no conspiracy had to finish. Too big a target when the megafauna fell. Too specialised when climate shifted and the big prey vanished like snow in spring. The second door is warmer. Dust floats in a thin beam as if the room itself remembers fire. Here the hybrid stories live. Old watchers descending, taking wives among humans, children coming into the world with appetites that terrify villages. Scripture calls them Nephilim. Sumer folds them into the Anunnaki web. In the Mediterranean you hear titans in the hills. Farther west, flood tales say giants walked until the waters rose. Different languages, same spine of meaning, mixed bloodlines, outsized bodies. A thread of red hair runs through more than one tale, a detail small enough to feel like memory instead of theatre. Lay a palm on the table. The wood is warm from a lamp. A ledger opens to a line about skulls so large their circumference strains the measuring tape. Teeth in 2 neat rows like a double picket fence. Some whisper these were not deformities but design. Others dismiss it as the way storytellers tidy chaos into pattern. Yet the myths click together with an ease that makes your neck prickle. Floods are not random here. They read like purges, a reset. The hybrid room carries that strange aftertaste. Order imposed after appetite ran wild. Close the door gently and let the latch find itself. The third room holds the conservative lens. No celestial parents, no lost branch with secret libraries of bone. Instead, outliers stretched by the loaded dice of genetics and geography. If islands can grow rodents like dogs and birds that forget to fly, Then a remote valley with rich food and a mild predator load might coax height and thickness the way pressure shapes coral. Reverse Flores, some might joke under their breath, where little people long ago shrink in lore while a different place pushes bodies upward, rib cages widening for lungs that feed long chases across open ground. The air here smells like paper glue and soil. Field notes line a shelf, bleached at the edges by a window no one admits exists. This reading says myths preserve memory, not monsters. A 9-foot hunter could anchor a story for 1,000 winters. A tribe that built with longer stride and stronger tendons could leave earthworks that normal hands admire and misread. Critics counter that double rows of teeth do not spring from diet or climate. Supporters suggest developmental quirks can cluster in small populations. The door hangs open just a touch, as if this room never needed to hide. Walk back to the tables. The femur sits where you left it. Lift it. The weight answers your grip with a low ache. Pathology alone struggles to explain this thickness matched with proportion. Pituitary giants in modern hospitals often carry fragile bones, stretched frames and hearts that tire too young. The bones on these tables feel scaled rather than stretched, joints broad, muscle scars etched deep into the cortex like signatures from a life of work. That's the quiet hinge, not tall alone, but hardy, big without breaking. You pause at the caliper and watch the jaws slide with a soft click. Some whisper a fourth door exists, but only in the ductwork. That theory says the rooms themselves are decoys. The real trick is not which explanation fits, but why the rooms were built at all. If the traits repeat across far-flung finds, heavy femurs, double teeth, skulls that outstrip our charts, then the puzzle shifts. The line between myth and ledger thins to gauze. The question tilts. Maybe the unbelievable part isn't that such beings walked here. Maybe the unbelievable part is that the walking left so little we can legally touch. The lights flicker. A tag flutters on a string and flips to its blank side. Your mind tries each door again, like a code. Separate branch and extinction by climate. Hybrid bloodlines and purges by flood. Outlier populations shaped by landscape and luck. They can all live under the same roof for a while. They don't knock each other down as neatly as a debate team hopes. The odd details keep returning like a refrain you can't shake. Teeth in 2 rows, jawbones that could slip over a face, skull walls thicker than your thumb. A draft creeps under the baseboard. Paper curls. Somewhere, a ledger page tears and holds by a single hole. That sound says more than any speech. Giants, if we call them that, are not the hard swallow. Libraries know how to file a large bone. What institutions have always handled poorly is the thing that cuts across categories. The kind of evidence that forces a shelf to move. The tense silence after someone says, "Show me!" and the drawer comes up empty from a vault that never runs out. You set the femur down, careful not to bruise the wood. 3 doors wait as they did before. None demands a final choice. That will come later, if it comes at all. For now, the hallway matters more than the rooms do. Hallways connect. Hallways control where feet go. Hallways can be locked from the far end, with a key you never see and a corridor you never walk. If the bones existed long enough to be weighed and measured, then vanished into paperwork and fog, the strangest thing in this building is not on the tables. It might be the holes in the memory of the place, the way tags flip to blank, the way catalogues stutter, the way a drawer slides shut and stays shut for a century. The doors can wait. The hallway knows the route out. And down there, past the turn where the light goes soft and the air turns cooler, something like an answer waits for a hand that isn't afraid to rattle a lock. You're back at the creek in Missouri. Water slides over gravel with a soft hiss, June air warm against your skin, and the mud gives under your fingertips like wet clay. A dragonfly skims the surface. The boy's hand sinks, catches on a smooth curve and lifts. No textbook held space for what he raised into the daylight. The creek kept its cool breath. The world tilted anyway. Let the air change. From summer light to the hum of a basement no one tours. Fluorescent bulbs flicker and steady, the buzz thin and steady like a tired insect. The room smells of old paper, machine oil and damp concrete. Rows of wooden crates stack into a kind of indoor canyon, labels browned by time, ink bled to ghosts. Some lids are screwed tight, edges tarred to keep out moisture. Others sit slightly ajar, a quarter-inch of dark where dust glows. A guard passes by slow, boot soles tapping a patient beat. He carries a thermos that clicks when it swings. He does not look up at the shelf with the number smudged to a blur. A catalogue card in a metal drawer has a corner torn away, the handwritten date fading to a pale rust colour. Between one audit and the next, a line item stops appearing. Heat pipes overhead tick and cool, then tick again, and a drip lands on a crate lid and spreads like a coin. One box is stencilled with a town no one outside the county remembers. The handwriting says anthropological specimen. Priority. The word priority underlined twice. The line below is careful and neat, a measurement impossible to accept without touching the thing itself. Supporters suggest it was packed with sawdust and hope. Others dismiss that hope as a small-town rumour, the kind that grows each time it's told. The crate is here long enough to gather a felt of grey dust, long enough for a clerk to sign received and file a copy. Then the paper trail thins like footprints in rain. You lean closer to a box that didn't settle properly. A sliver of light slips through the seam. Inside, pale fragments catch the glow. Curve of something that could be a jaw arc. The smooth dome of bone rubbed by 1,000 seasons of soil. A label scrap clings to a nail torn across the year. It crackles when the air moves. No display tag, no frame, no glass. Only the storage smell and the weight of a thing you cannot lift with one hand. There's a metal cabinet at the end of the aisle. Its paint is chipped back to the primer, and the lock has a stubborn bite. Inventory sheets inside rustle because the vent sighs. One sheet lists an accession number that once matched a newspaper story about a creek and a boy. The accession has a pencil note, "Move to alt storage." The next sheet lists the same number with a question mark, then nothing. A whole conversation reduced to an unfinished mark on cheap paper. The rhythm emerges. First there were local finds, the kind that draw neighbours and a doctor with a tape measure. Then packing, shipping, and the comfort of believing the nation's attic will keep what matters. Then a narrowing. Newspaper lines dry up. Museum floors fill with safer tales. A curator shrugs and points you to collections policy. Some whisper that policy becomes a curtain when it needs to be. Critics counter that storage is a mercy, not a graveyard. Yet the hall is full of boxes that never breathe gallery air. Condensation crawls down a cold water pipe and taps at a crate whose stencils are barely legible. The drip leaves a dark bruise on the lid, then another. Inside, wood shavings cushion an object wrapped in canvas, corners tied with cotton cord. The canvas is stained in a shape that matches a curve. A femur could leave a shape like that. You can feel the heft in your forearms just by looking at the outline, the way it would drag at your muscles if you tried to lift it wrong. Down the aisle, a clipboard hangs from a nail. The top page has 4 columns and space for a signature. Only the first row is filled, a date from a century ago. A name you could trace to a lunch counter somewhere long gone. The rest of the page is clean, except for a smudge where a thumb paused. Out past the loading dock, you can still hear the train if you listen hard enough. Metal on metal. The same sound that carried crates east. An old photograph sits loose in a file folder, corners dog-eared, gelatin silver going chalky at the edges. 2 men stand beside a long pale outline laid on grass. A child is there, one hand at his mouth. The measuring rod makes a neat ladder of inches. Someone penciled a height on the back. The ink beside it says, "Forwarded." No mention of where it landed. No note of a drawer number, a shelf name, a case. The pattern tilts in the light, and its meaning sharpens. Loose bones in fields, bones in crates, crates in warehouses. A narrative adjusted until the odd shapes don't snag fingers anymore. the old myths turned into campfire fare, the hard edges of measurements softened with new language until the numbers sound like exaggeration. And yet, here, wood fibre swells and contracts with the seasons around something wrapped in tide. A breeze is not possible in a room like this, but air shifts when the door at the far end opens and shuts. The guard's footsteps pass again. He coughs once. Somewhere a cartwheel squeaks, then stops. You can almost map the absence by its soundscape. The quiet of wings where a display should be. The bright chatter of visitors that never reaches this place. The cases upstairs hold pottery and beads. The crates below hold what won't fit the story people paid to see. Sometimes what's missing tells the louder story. Empty glass. A catalogue with a hole where a number belongs. A clerk's note with a word crossed out twice. Somewhere a skull sits under canvas, its teeth doubled like a zipper, its arch larger than a handspan. It has travelled farther in its afterlife than most of us will in ours. If a skeleton surfaced tomorrow with dates that knock at the door of our timeline and proportions no course can soften, what path would it take? The crate, the case, the label that blinks and vanishes from the catalogue, or a lit hall with schoolchildren passing by, chins lifted, counting teeth that challenge the scale we've been taught? You stand in the glow of bad lights and mild dust, listening for an answer that stays just beyond the hum,